Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our third Scottish Fishing Conference. Promises to be a great 2 days with some excellent speakers from Scotland, the UK and abroad. Before we start, I would just like to remind you what Fisheries Innovation Scotland is and what it does. It's a unique public-private partnership that has been established in order to explore innovative solutions to the many problems facing the Scottish fishing industry. In many ways, its guiding mission is that innovation, whether technical, policy or behavioural, can help make the Scottish fishing industry more sustainable. Fisheries Innovation Scotland is funded by Marine Scotland, Seafish, Scottish Fishermen's Federation, Scottish Natural Heritage, Young Seafood, Sainsbury's, Marks and Spencer's, and Funding Fish. So a spread from fish catching, fish processing, private sector, through government, through retail and the NGO sector. And those funding bodies all are represented by a trustee, and the Board of Trustees is the governing body of Fisheries Innovation Scotland. In addition to that, we have a technical advisory committee, a TAC, that includes some of the best minds in fisheries research in Scotland, and the TAC's role is to advise the Board of Trustees. FIS does three things. Most importantly, we commission research into areas that we believe have the potential for innovation and for driving change. That's the main part of our work, and today you'll hear the outcome of some of that research. We also have an international bursary where we sponsor somebody young from the Scottish fishing industry to work and study abroad. And in that respect, we'll be hearing from Hannah Fennell later today. And finally, we organise this conference every second year, which, judging by the number of delegates here just now and the delegates who will be coming tomorrow, is becoming ever more popular with, I think, a record number this year. Our theme tomorrow is fisheries management in changing times, and what a relevant theme that is. Brexit has changed everything in Scotland, including fishing. On Wednesday of last week, the UK government published its Fisheries White Paper. That has set out the government's vision and its hopes, but inevitably, and quite understandably, there is no certainty what the eventual outcome will be. We will hear over the next few days, next couple of days, of the opportunities that are hoped for and the problems that are feared. We will leave on Tuesday night, I'm sure, even though we probably won't be any clearer what the eventual outcome might be. I believe we'll all leave on Tuesday night with a better understanding of what the main issues are for the Scottish fishing industry. Today, however, as I said, is an opportunity to hear the outcome of our recent research project. So the plan for today is we will hear short summaries of all of the research projects which have been done in the past year. And at the end of that, we will use that time to try and capture from you any feedback, any thoughts, any observations, and perhaps most importantly of all, any suggestions as to what future research Fisheries Innovation Scotland could or should be doing in the future. So I'd like to hand over to Dave Parker. Dave is the chair of the TAC. Dave has had a career in the fishery sector for quite some time. He spent some time as working for Young Seafood and now works for an international NGO. And Dave has very competently and successfully chaired the TAC for the last couple of years. So Dave.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that kind introduction. So, hello and welcome, everybody. Welcome to the third biannual Scottish Fishing Conference for FIS. So, as John said, I am the chair of the Technical Advisory Committee for Fisheries Innovation Scotland, and it's my great privilege to keep together some of the fine minds in Scottish fisheries science and help to advise the board on the way forward for FIS. And today we're going to talk about some of those projects that we've been going through over the last 18 months, really. I've got to apologise first for the weather. I know it's been fantastic, and today it's a little bit colder and a little bit cloudier, but I see that's a great opportunity because there's no distractions from the exciting world of fisheries science and solutions. So, without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, who is Dan Skerritt from MRAG. So if you'd like to come to the table, we're actually lucky enough to have a double dip from Dan today. We've got two projects that he will be representing. One of them was actually put together by his colleague, so he's been dropped this one. So thanks. I'm looking forward to great things from Dan. Yeah. You got everything you need, Dan? Ready to
That's
go?
it, yeah, I'm good to go.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for everyone, and thanks for inviting me back to present some of the results from FIS 10. This is a project, desk-based study that we started in April 2016. So if you can cast your mind back, that's BB, before Brexit. So a few of the things that kind of we started to talk about in that project obviously had to change quite quickly as the project evolved. I'll do my best to kind of reflect that in this and hopefully bring it up to date. I mean, it's changing, as you say, all the time. Quite big events changing again last night in the world of Brexit. So, as I said, a little bit of context to what the project was. Basically, based on the reported benefits that there are of involving and integrating stakeholders into the policy process, decision making and management, that's led to this growing desire over the last number of decades to promote more participation or co-management, which is essentially kind of the sharing of power or responsibility between the kind of regulators and the regulated, as it were. Co-management is often kind of thought of as a bit of a kind of continuum. It's not just one thing, one packaged thing, and it can move from kind of co-management by consultation through to partnership and then co-management through delegation. So where almost all the power is then given over, handed over. It's a transfer of kind of power. However, regardless of kind of the title we give this process, it's really about the nature of the process that kind of defines whether a decision made is successful. So it's not the title we give to it, it's more about how the stakeholders are represented, how they participate, the kind of level of engagement and their level of satisfaction that leads to successful management rather than, this is deemed co-management because we followed this, this and this. Most people agree that modern kind of policy production should be flexible, should be innovative. There's an example I've used which is e-democracy, which is it's not really a defined term for that, but basically it just means using communication technology to get enhanced stakeholder engagement and stakeholder involvement. Two kind of examples of this that you'll see and you'll probably be aware of is Parliament Live TV, which is this top-down, so the government are the kind of control or the outputs from it, and it's one way, it's not interactive, and that's a website that you can, and I'm sure you've all been on, where you can watch live debates and it records all the public communications by Parliament. Another example of e-democracy that's been used more and more is the UK Government and Parliament's petitions website. I'm sure you've all probably been on this. And basically, this is bottom-up in that anybody can start a petition. Once that petition gets to, I think it's the magic number is 100,000, I was going to say likes, signatures, it then gets debated by Parliament. So then this is a two-way kind of example of e-democracy. So it starts from the bottom, it goes to Parliament, and then that can keep going. And this is just an example that I put up from this morning that I think at the moment had about 32,000 signatories. Furthermore, there's been quite a recent trend, I say recent, last 10, 20 years, towards kind of ecosystem-based fisheries management, bringing in wider stakeholders. So the number of stakeholders involved in fishery discussions now has kind of, increased massively in the last 10, 20 years. Now got kind of, e-NGOs are expected to be at the table, whereas maybe 20 years ago, not so much. So we've got a wide group of stakeholders kind of involved in this communication, all trying to have influence or needing influence into the policy production. So as I say, the FIS 10 focused on kind of future co-production of Scottish fishery policy, how stakeholders are currently integrated in the decision, and they started to initiate discussions regarding the future fisheries governance in Scotland. How this could respond and adapt to new challenges, including the EU referendum, as I say, that kind of happened about 3 months into the study. It focused on kind of the key issues of stakeholder representation and engagement, the manner in which they participate, rather than kind of the process that we termed it. It's kind of how that actual process went about. And then at the end, it kind of proposed some options for improving stakeholder participation. It was revolved around kind of broad themes rather than being quite kind of a descriptive best practice. It focused on kind of ideas rather than, I'd say, kind of a best practice formula. So the study had 5 key tasks. It was desk-based lit review of co-production, which I won't really touch on. You can read the report that's excellently archived on the FIS website. We did a quick overview of the current system in Scotland, and as I say at the time, there's quite a lot of layers to that, which I'll talk about quickly. Then we did 3 international case studies of kind of governance. We picked the Canadian Atlantic cod collapse in the 90s, which I'll talk about, Norwegian discard ban and English shifkers in response to the Marine Coastal Access Act. I won't really touch on these last 2 because there's almost certainly better people in this room that are probably more experienced to tell you about that. And then finally we did this iterative stakeholder consultation process where it was kind of a remote way of trying to engage with selected panels of stakeholders to see if this kind of process of going back and almost creating this anonymous dialogue between stakeholders was a feasible way of kind of looking for disagreement or consensus. And then finally we tried to synthesize all this into some findings and some kind of options for moving forward. So the Scottish situation, as I'm first up, this is probably quite a relevant slide. I won't bore you with it though, but the Scottish fleet is really large. So kind of the continued sustainability of it is really important for, you know, not just Scotland and the UK, but the EU as a whole. It's relatively diverse. There's generally accepted as 4 key segments, kind of pelagics, demersal whitefish, nephroc trawl fishery, and your static shell fisheries. But importantly, each of those different segments, both between them and within them, particularly with the whitefish fishery, have got their own pressures and successes. So each individual kind of fisher has these different stresses that they want to try and get over into the policy, have an influence on it. Much of the management in Scotland has devolved from central UK government, but as I say at the time of writing, and currently now managed under the EU Common Fisheries Policy. Within the Common Fisheries Policy, there's 2 kind of key routes for decisions to be made. The first is quite direct. Basically, ICs have to collate information from the member states, feed information about stock assessments into the Commission. They advise them on how to set their tax quotas. The second one is kind of is less direct, and it's through consultations with stakeholders, through the kind of the ACS, I think they were formerly known as the RACs, and other external bodies. Kind of despite these perceived constraints to the CFP, with these kind of only these 2 key routes, Scotland's had this kind of clear trend towards greater co-management, more kind of sharing of power, as it were. And it's been kind of perceived to have led the way in adopting progressive and interactive systems, such as conservation credit schemes, I think, 10 years ago, and the RFIGs in 2016. Kind of to convey all these kind of different levels of interactions and opportunities for these stakeholders to kind of engage, we basically tried to form a kind of map of this, of where decisions are made and how information is fed into the Scottish Fisheries Minister. It looks a little bit like that. As I say, this is scheduled to change. Obviously, this kind of left-hand side with the fisheries local action groups and the EU kind of element of it is uncertain what's going to happen there. But it just gives you a quick understanding of how much information is kind of flowing. And so these stakeholder representatives and the individual stakeholders are trying to kind of operate within this and understanding how to interact at each point of this kind of network. And although it kind of looks quite complicated, actually when you kind of look into it, the kind of the engagement process is quite standardized. It's quite similar every time. It's basically, as say, through consultation, decision making remains centralized largely in Scotland, and as I say, co-management is really done through this consultation. So after we'd kind of described the Scottish situation, as I say, this gets a lot more complicated when you start breaking down the UK government side of it with the IFCAs and things like that. We did a number of international case studies. I'll just give a quick overview of what those 3 case studies are, kind of overarching findings between them, and then as I say, I'll focus on the Canadian one. So basically, you found, as we all know, policy process is very dynamic, and as such, let's say, best practices for kind of how to do engagement are often of limited use. Instead, it was found that really processes should aim to be responsive and adaptive. So instead of always thinking about the end goal and having a prescribed route to that, it's about like reacting to what you've done and trying to constantly improve. I mean, this was really evident, as I say, when we were doing the study and we started out and then suddenly the referendum comes along and, you know, our end goal has completely changed already. You know, that map becomes, you know, outdated. The 3 studies also highlighted that uncertainty and difficulties that arise when decisions are made with imperfect knowledge. I'll come on to this with more information in the Canadian case study, kind of describe what I mean there about making decisions with imperfect knowledge and the kind of dangers of that. And then an important similarity, certainly with the first 2, is that often significant changes in governance are often triggered by a crisis, whether that's a stock collapse or you know, the sudden implementation of new policy. And at the same time, when change is discussed with kind of in less immediate terms, so when there isn't, when everything's going well, it's often harder to kind of make a change. You know, does that make sense? And so when changes do occur, it often results in this, you know, the stakeholders' roles change completely and their behaviours subsequently change. And this often leads to this key paradox that comes up quite often, that interactions in the event of a crisis can lead to innovations and change, and that crisis has the effect of focusing the discussion. So with the cod collapse, you know, you've got one issue that you need to solve and suddenly you can get together and make the right changes, if that makes sense. So on to the Canadian cod collapse case study. As I say, I'll try and summarise this in my understanding in 2 slides, but it's quite complex. There's an excellent book, I think it's called Fishing for Truths. I can't remember who wrote it, but I'd recommend reading that if you're interested. So at the time of the collapse and as it was kind of happening, power resided solely with the Minister of Fisheries in Canada and the DFO, Department for Fisheries and Oceans, I think. It was kind of, you ended up with this relationship of the regulator and the regulated, kind of the manager and the managed. You know, it was very defined like that. This kind of relationship, it was reported, it kind of led to perverse incentives, like maybe, you know, landing illegal fish, and a lack of control over the effort. So there's this disconnect between the 2 kind of groups of stakeholders. Subsequently, kind of contradictions between what the science was saying and what the fishers were experiencing out fishing, particularly the coastal fleet, led to kind of questions over the validity of the stock assessment. And this created, again, this added to the, this poor relationship and this illusion of certainty. And the report talks quite a lot, the FIS report, about kind of treating uncertainty as a social issue, not a technical issue. And it essentially saying, you know, instead of trying to model your way out of it, it was kind of using communication between the different stakeholders to kind of treat uncertainty not as an issue, but kind of as something you can work together, you know, to solve. So the collapse of this, you know, iconic fishery at the time led to rather important, I mean unwelcome, but important chance for Canada, the DFO and the Minister, to reflect on the kind of attitudes of the different stakeholders about the fishery, how it should be, you know, run, and how these reviews were or weren't reflected in the management. Subsequently, it led to a more participatory approach. You know, the government, industry and academia now, as is happening throughout the world and particularly in the UK as well, to cooperate. You know, there's much more cooperation in the stock assessment of fishers and scientists in Canada. Essentially, the conclusion of quite a lot of, you know, I say it's a very well-studied collapse. Conclusions generally say that, you know, having fisher support is a precondition for sustainability of policy and in terms of the fishery. And as I say, this resulted in quite significant change in the roles and behaviours of the stakeholders. I've added another slide here because, you know, I've painted quite a great picture of the outcome of it, but it wasn't necessarily plain sailing. The kind of form of co-management to start with, although it had that great label, what was initially pursued focused on kind of sharing responsibilities with specific sectoral interests. So rather than the wider community being involved in, you know, in every decision or discussion, it was kind of the DFO were engaging somewhat with individual fleet segments on individual issues. And it was reported this led to two key drawbacks. Firstly, it kind of institutionalised these fleet segments. The fishers weren't kind of seen as this part of this members of coastal communities, but were rather set like individual groups kind of isolated off. And you ended up with competing interests. Secondly, it overlooks a potentially positive role in management of the wider community, so not just those directly involved in the fishery, but wider communities in kind of helping increase sustainability and overcome uncertainty. Despite this, the process highlighted the role of all stakeholders in responding to crisis, establishing reflection and enabling change, and generally was seen as, you know, a successful response to quite an awful situation. So following the case studies that we kind of looked at and tried to look at what lessons were learned from those, we did quite a short stakeholder engagement process with kind of selected panel. It was really to kind of, as well, see whether we can kind of use this iterative process of going back and creating, let's say, this kind of anomalous, not anomalous, this kind of dialogue between stakeholders. So I'm not going to talk to detail about this because there was quite a lot of questions. It went on, I think, 3 iterations. It's all in the report, but it just shows you with this example here of that policy production processes can create these kind of levels of complexity, and people's or stakeholders' understanding of the process is often reflected by how kind of closely engaged they are with it. So you can see here the kind of government representatives, quite, you know, fortunately, understood the process quite well, which is great. You know, those that are on the peripheral, so like some of the fishers had mixed responses, and then the NGOs had that were least understood the process. The ones we interviewed, you know, this isn't across all NGOs. But it just shows you that kind of, you know, it's even harder, therefore, for when people don't understand the process, they're often on the periphery. So it's not just a case of kind of giving them the opportunity to engage. It's kind of ensuring that they know how to and know what to do when they are given that opportunity. Does that make sense? It's not just, you know, sending them out the questionnaire, it's ensuring they have the kind of tools and the understanding to really engage in the process. There was a few kind of key findings from stakeholder engagement. Most stakeholders feel as though they understood and felt engaged in policy production in Scotland, but in practice felt that there wasn't really scope for disagreement, often reducing the transparency. Participation was seen as highly political. Some groups were considered to benefit more than other groups to this. I think that's often the case when you ask people how much they benefit from policy decisions. It was seen that powerful actors could determine the direction of the debate. As so, a lot of this was seen as though, you know, future direction could lead to more effort into kind of trying to make sure that it's accessible for newcomers. That might not just be new groups of stakeholders, but members of a certain group that aren't actually currently engaging. It's not just about giving the opportunities, so it's ensuring they, you know, understand how to engage in the process. So the key conclusions for the study was that, as I said before, success of co-management often depends on the process rather than the kind of following some set rules of best practice. Adaptive approaches were seen as important, including kind of monitoring and reflection. Social pressures and influences of personality often can be reduced using technological solutions, this e-democracy. Obviously, there's always going to be a need for kind of meetings and having people around a table, but this is like another tool that you can supplement that with. As I say, this can also help ensure greater access for other stakeholders. And generally, Scotland was seen to have quite a strong participatory platform to build on for developing new and innovative solutions. Obviously, now with EU exit, that potentially gives us this opportunity for change that we may not have had when we started this study, before Brexit. But there's now that opportunity for us to kind of look at this and address and see where do we want to see improvements in this. And then, so from that, we kind of picked 5 key thematic areas where we thought that future options could be considered to try and improve stakeholder engagement. And I'll quickly run through them, conscious of time. Basically, this was kind of reflexivity, which is a kind of social science term for, rather than, say, focus on single solutions and ideal models, it's about kind of constant self-evaluation and improvement. Accountability, so are there mechanisms in place to ensure accountability? How is that reflected in the processes that you use? Representation, so the type of representation, not necessarily like the level that you've had, but are all sectors or all segments within a fleet kind of do their opinions reflect what's being discussed in the dialogue? And then fourthly, inclusivity. Say accessibility is not equal between and even within stakeholder groups, and this can kind of impact the satisfaction that particular segments or areas are feeling with the process. And say technological advances can help to try and probably reduce this. And then disagreement and uncertainty, as I say, this is often puts fear into people, but we kind of try to put across that this can often be quite a healthy thing. It's good to have uncertainty, it's good to have disagreement and try and work together to solve that rather than trying to, brush over it. As I say, during the Canadian COD collapse, there was this term of the illusion of certainty, which kind of led to this further, the 2 stakeholder groups moving further apart, and that's certainly something that should be avoided. Often, engagement processes are always trying to find consensus. It's always seen as though if you don't have consensus, it's not been successful, but that's not necessarily the case. So yeah, that was kind of a whistle-stop tour of the report, which is on the FIS website. Shall I go straight into the next one?
Yeah, I'll just introduce our next speaker.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Daniel. Very informative. Fantastic piece of work. I really like the part where you mentioned that uncertainty is a social issue, because if you think about it, when we're most stressed in our lives, a lot of the time there's a massive amount of uncertainty there. But actually embracing that and embracing disagreement is a great start to any discussion. So thank you for that. I just want to remind everyone in the room today that these reports are telling us some of the issues and they're offering us some solutions, but actually it's up to us to take this in, to take this information in and work out how we can apply this to Scottish fisheries and fisheries wider to actually make a real difference and a real change, and that's what FIS is all about. On the point of questions, if you could write down any questions that you have or keep them in your mind's eye, we're going to actually do questions at the end just to get the flow through and to make sure that everyone has a good chance to speak. So apologies for that. Okay, so we've had innovation in governance and management above water, and now Daniel again with innovation below water in selectivity. So please go ahead. Thanks,
Dave. As Dave said, I'm presenting this on behalf of my colleagues who couldn't attend, Chris Mees and Tim Davis, who did the study. So I will try and get through it without reading from my notes too much. As I say, it's available online, so that'll be your best port of call if you want to know more about it. Again, this was a desk-based study that was started in 2016. I think it ran for 6 months, and it was looking at selectivity. So generally, there's several kind of push factors on the fishers generally to kind of increase selectivity of their fishing practices. Selectivity here is defined as the capacity of either a fishing method or a gear type to kind of capture certain sections of a fish population, whether that's a mixed species population, and kind of avoid the unwanted portions. The EU landing obligation is probably the most kind of obvious push factor, driving the need for this selectivity and to avoid unwanted catch, which was previously discarded catch probably. So that unwanted catch can be kind of categorised in several ways. It can either be the wrong species, i.e. non-target, not the fish we're after. It could also be a species or a stock with even no tack set to it, or that particular vessel or skipper doesn't have quota for it. So ideally they want to avoid that fish. It could also be the wrong size, below the minimum landing size, which I think we're all going to have to start calling the minimum conservation reference size soon, I think. Or a particular size of fish might command too low a price in the kind of marketplace for it to be, so it becomes unwanted, less desirable fish. Damaged fish as well through impact either with the gear, predation on like things like long lines, or even mishandling once it gets on the deck. I think a good example of that actually, I think Sea Fish have been doing some work on these double-ended, double cod-end trawl nets for nephrops, try and get the nephrops and the flatfish separated to keep the kind of quality of the fish. And then the final thing is potentially too many fish. Can there be such a thing, eh? So a bit more project context specific to Scotland. The bulk of the Scottish catches are made by quite a few gear types really, but the variation in design of different trawl nets, where they fish, the practice that the skipper uses means that kind of selectivity studies are actually quite complicated. It's not that straightforward, particularly in mixed fisheries, where you've got various species all being hauled together and their grounds are overlapping. That becomes really problematic. There's been quite a few approaches to mitigate discards, tax and quotas and things, but most relevant to this study are things like spatial restrictions, trying to close areas off where maybe juvenile fish are kind of tend to hang around, selective gears and methods, increasing societal awareness of discard issues. Furthermore, knowledge sharing, awareness campaigns, fisher training. As I've said, I've already mentioned the kind of Sea Fish day that they do in Norway, if any of you have been lucky enough to go to it. And they provide this critical increase in uptake of new approaches to selectivity. So the project focused on trying to reduce unwanted catch, but it was desk-based, as I said. It was trying to gather all these wonderful and wild ideas from all over, not just fisheries, to see what's feasible to try and move forward in terms of increasing selectivity of fishing gear. It provided this framework, as I say, for future requirements. We didn't do any selectivity trials. And it had these 5 objectives here. So there's a typology, which I'll very quickly go over. As I say, you can see the report for that. It identified and scoped out a few novel ideas. I'm going to talk about 2 of them today that are interesting. And then the main focus of it was to try and chart the pathway, identify roadblocks in developing selective gears, work out a strategic plan for future selectivity initiatives, and then identify potential funding sources. So really the main report kind of focuses on that and how to push them through. But for this presentation, I'm focusing on the novel ideas because it's more interesting, isn't it? So typology of gears and practices. Generally speaking, selectivity of fishing gear can be modified at 3 stages, and I think this is a really key thing to think about. Unwanted fish can be avoided completely, so before the net goes anywhere near them. As we said, spatial areas is the most obvious form of this. By adopting certain fishing behaviours, restricting areas, using deterrents, or modifying profile of gear. And this is often based on the kind of behaviour of the fish, the distribution of the fish, the biology. Unwanted fish can also be allowed to escape from fishing gear post-capture. So the picture here of colleagues, Dan Watson, I think you were involved quite heavily in that, weren't you, Dave? Project Trawl Light, safety net project, which used kind of lights to attract the fish towards these escape vents and out once they've entered the net. And then the third kind of opportunity to reduce unwanted fish is post-capture. So once they're in the net, either in the cod end or even once you hauled them onto the deck. these latter two stages, it's important to note that can't really be considered selectivity if the fish aren't getting out undamaged. You know, they need to be kind of preserved enough that they're going to survive post being selected out. Otherwise, it's not really selectivity. You're just kind of brushing it under the carpet. But as I say, the key message is that there are three opportunities, or broad opportunities, where we can reduce unwanted fish. And then this is a bit more detail on the typology. I think this extends on quite a lot, and this is a reduced version. But as I say, pre-capture avoidance is usually based on the biology or ecology of the fish, what we know about them, where they're distributed, what stimuli they respond to, often their swimming behaviour, so how can we avoid them in that manner. Post-capture methods generally work by exploiting variation in size or swimming behaviour. Again, you can kind of, certain fish react to the, the chains on the bottom in a particular way. They might rise up, considerably higher than a different fish, and you can select them off in that way. Examples of this include kind of like, square mesh panels that we're all aware of, escape holes, and as I say, these artificial lights to try and move fish around in the net. And then post-harvest sorting of fish, this is what's commonly kind of, we saw it all on the TV a few years ago. This is what's normally associated with discarding or unwanted fish. And as much as commercial, TV chefs, fishermen don't like this anyway either. Nobody really likes this practice. And it's not really ideal either. It takes quite a lot of time. The fish have already kind of gone through that process of capture, of being caught. So this isn't really the ideal time to sort them. So the two novel ideas that I've been asked to talk about, automated post-haul selectivity systems. This selects the fish after hauling and hopefully releases the unwanted fish. That's the idea of it. Hauled fish must be in a good condition, as I said before, with chance of survival, otherwise it's not really selectivity. So it's limited to certain species that can kind of go through the capture process. I think there's a note here as well about the landing obligation, because there's a little bit of ambiguity about the kind of precise definition of when is a fish caught. Is it once it's in the net, when it's on the deck, in a box under ice? So I think there's a little bit of uncertainty on this area. The requirements of this, as said, it needs low impact transport system to not damage the fish. Existing systems for krill, you've probably all seen these kind of krill vacuums that just keep, continually fishing and pumping the krill on in quite a good condition, already exist. Automated selection process and separator. And as I say, the main technological components exist. Pump transport systems are used kind of all over the world now in, I think it says on the next slide, yeah. Fisheries, aquaculture for moving fish around. I think they use vacuums for large fish, centrifuges for small fish. They use them in fish passages on these huge dams over 15 metres. So the technology is already there. Fish identification for selectivity purposes of fisheries research. I think these systems also exist already. So video systems for counting and measuring fish do exist. Been lots of work, on kind of passing certain shellfish, particularly under cameras that can identify them instantly. I know there's a lot of work in the kind of tuna fisheries where they don't have to, for the transshipment, where they can just pass the fish past an acoustic camera and it starts counting them automatically. So these technologies already exist. There's prototype systems called deep vision, which although at the moment isn't necessarily used for selectivity, the people that are developing it recognise that this could be used for a kind of future application in fisheries. So the next steps, what would be needed to create such a wonderful device? Basically, because the technology is already available, it was considered this research and development project, might be quite short. As I say, I would refer you to the report with regards to the next step section, really. So the second novel idea is this automated pre-capture avoidance system, so before the fish enter the net. The concept is that you can identify and track the fish in the path of the net, so before they kind of approach it, and potentially manipulate the gear or even the fish to avoid entering the net and being caught. This one kind of reminds me of what they do, and I don't know if you've seen like in plastic recycling systems. And they have these like little laser pointers that blow air and fire off different coloured plastics into different like little compartments. It's quite cool. I think it's on YouTube. Don't know how relevant it would be for fisheries, but so what would the requirements be? I mean, real-time sensory systems provide information on the size and species of the fish as it's kind of approaching the net. And then again, the gear must be automatically or manually controlled to change the shape. I mean, this already kind of exists to some extent. We can manipulate nets, you know, the size of them as we're going, but as I say, some technological components do exist. Fish identification systems are there, but whether they're kind of quick enough to do it as we're trawling along. Not aware of any automated systems yet. Can driverless car technology be adapted? That's not sure. Basically, autonomous vehicles already exist, and they use this kind of sense, plan, act design, i.e. they sense it with some kind of instrument. You know, in the marine environment, we can use acoustics is generally the best method. They plan, they have some kind of software algorithm that kind of makes a decision, and then they act. They move the fish or move the net out of the way. There is some work on this being done in the UK, as I say, not necessarily directly relevant to fisheries, but again, I would refer you to the report. And essentially, then the last part of the report, or the bulk of it, which I'll quickly summarise in a minute, is about the pathway to change. One of the hardest things to do is to actually get these ideas onto a fishing boat. And it goes through the drivers of change are things like some kind of event like the EU land navigation. Then you have to develop the system. It has to then be be accepted by the fishers. And this is often where a barrier breaks down in this lack of knowledge or lack of knowledge sharing to try and get it get the solution in place. There was then 4 kind of themes for new areas, new projects that FIS might be able to invest in order to address these barriers: communication, awareness raising, and visualising the gear, kind of getting that uptake onto the fishing boat. And funding sources were also listed on there. Yeah, please try and read the report to get a better overview of that study. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Daniel. That was a brilliant double dip there. I know I heard it's giving someone else's presentation, so we very much appreciate that. Okay, so next we're going to stick with innovation below the water. The board and the Technical Advisory Committee were so keen on this subject that we've actually commissioned 2. So you'll notice the project titles 11A and 11B. So Daniel's really nicely synthesised information and set the scene for our next speaker, Paul Fernandez, and also Tara Marshall from the University of Aberdeen. Paul is also a member of the Technical Advisory Committee, and they'll be talking to us today about the smart fish selective retention.
Thank you, David. Okay, good afternoon. My name's Tara Marshall. I'm giving the first half of the presentation on Project FIS 11B. So like everybody else, I will implore you to go to the website and read the report. It's fascinating, absolutely. So this, in simple terms, the starting point is what can be done to reduce the catch of unwanted species or sizes. So Daniel's already given you an orientation to the issue. The approach that was taken in this report was 2 separate approaches. Firstly, to improve the spatial selectivity, and secondly, to improve gear selectivity. So I'm here to speak about enhanced spatial selectivity with Paul doing the gear afterwards. So spatial selectivity is an obvious thing. Why is it so important to the problem of reducing unwanted catch? Skippers make a huge range of tactical decisions before they go out to sea, and one of the tactical decisions that is very, very important to the outcome is choosing where to go to fish. So that is part of the solution. There's no silver bullet here. We need integrated solutions. So one part is spatial selectivity. Okay, so I'm going to describe for those of you who are unfamiliar with the concept what real-time reporting is and how it can enhance spatial selectivity of fishing fleet. So in the basic outline, it is really an information sharing. After the catch comes on board, the fishing vessels rapidly upload information about unwanted catch. The nature of the unwanted catch can be quite dynamic through time at certain points. At certain years, it can be juvenile cod, for example, or choke species, very dynamic picture. This information is uploaded to a central database that has some degree of information management going on. The unwanted catch data is combined with the corresponding VMS data about where the vessel was fishing, and then this triggers alerts to be disseminated to participating vessels. So this is the schematic. Really, I was thinking I should have put a pie in that little cloud to suggest that maybe this is a pie in the sky solution. But in fact, it's not a pie in the sky. We have the information at our fingertips in the VMS information, in the e-logbook information. It's just not coming together and being integrated and disseminated. The upshot is that you would get something like a map indicating areas that you might wish to avoid. So the objectives of this first part of FIS 11B, review the suitability of existing databases for real-time reporting, then investigate how real-time reporting is being used to reduce bycatch in a real-world example, the Eastern Bering Sea. We undertook consultations with industry and Marine Scotland to determine what was both feasible and desirable. We developed a detailed set of technical requirements for implementation and identified sources of enabling funding. So the example that the report focuses on is how real-time reporting is being used in the Bering Sea pollock fishery, one of the largest in the world. Strict bycatch limits have been in place by federal legislation since the 1990s. These are very strong limits. Exceeding these targets would result and has resulted in industry shutdown. No discarding is permitted. This part of the world has functioned under a discard ban for over 20 years. So the fishing industry had to meet these rules, and they were tasked with this challenge in the 1990s. So they began the process of laboriously developing real-time reporting. It wasn't easy. The industry was quite resistant, but they had no choice. So what I'm going to show to you this afternoon is sort of the 20 years of evolution on how to deal with this issue. So currently what's done, and it's done within the individual fishing co-ops. So vessels belong to a fishing co-op, and the co-op manages the information collectively. As a result of some information processing, skippers receive alerts when a vessel in the co-op achieves some sort of high measure of bycatch. So these alerts come out to a smartphone, a laptop, an onboard computer, and you can see this is what they look like. And you can see that there's a couple of hot links there in blue that if you click on those links, it will take you to what I'll show in the next slide. These type of information products, which are very much like geographical information system type reporting. So what we see here are the Aleutian Islands in green. The image on the left, you may not be able to see it, but it's showing you individual hull tracks for a vessel on a particular date. You have a certain degree of selectivity, so these would be the different vessels belonging to the cooperative. The hull tracks are coded in color according to the magnitude of the bycatch that was obtained. The figure on the right is, keep in mind, this is salmon bycatch in the pollock fishery. So they color code the discard information, According to the lowest 50%, sort of mid-range of yellow is 50 to 80%, and red is the highest 20%. So it's sort of a hot spot and cold spot mapping procedure. You might be thinking, what on earth are they doing sharing information like this? They are only sharing information on species they want to avoid. They're bycatch species. They are not sharing information about target species. So this type of information is also facilitated in the industry by observers. They have 100% observer coverage that is funded by the industry. And that's obviously a tactical decision that they've made to sort of arrange their business plans. I think that that's where they're spending their money, and one of the forms of spending the money, as well as the costs of managing the database themselves. Okay, so we held some workshops in Aberdeen and Peterhead. In September 2016, we had Carl Haflinger, who was really the father of real-time reporting in this part of the world, and Eric Torgerson, who's involved in writing the software to implement this. There was, at these workshops, there was a lot of discussion. Some of you participated in the workshop. There was support for empowering industry to use their spatial information more effectively. The salmon bycatch issue was regarded as interesting, but they found a more natural analog with the use of real-time reporting in the fisheries off the coast of Oregon and Washington, where it very much is a mixed fishery with complex species composition. Industry also recognized they needed to be supported in assuming responsibility for this type of exercise. So we had a variety of consultations in the project that are described in the report. I'd like to acknowledge the interactions with the producers' organizations. They would be key to any implementation of real-time reporting, because they really are there facilitating on a day-to-day basis the high-frequency decisions and outcomes that are going on. I'd really like to acknowledge David Anderson at APCO, who was particularly inspirational. We developed an implementation plan, and the report has a variety of feedback. Marine Scotland obviously needs to be on board and supportive of the goal of co-management, allowing the industry to sort of organize itself in this way. And also, obviously, I'd like to make the point that universities can provide technical support. There's nothing that scientists love better than data, and this is just an amazing source of data in real time. And there's certainly knowledge transfer partnership schemes that exist to facilitate that. Since the project was funded, we did prepare some funding applications. There were follow-up discussions with industry and the FIS board. The industry felt in the long term that real-time reporting was a useful tool and should be developed, but they are currently, or at least at the time we were preparing proposals, busy with the complexities of exiting the EU. So that's where things stand now, and if you want to talk further, then catch me at coffee.
Okay, thank you, Tara. I'm Paul Fernandez. I'm also at the University of Aberdeen, and I'm going to talk to you about what we're calling Smart Trawl, which is a vision for the future of trawling. It touches on some of the concepts that Daniel spoke about before, and the inspiration for it came from this slide, actually, and work that I've done with the Alaska Fisheries Science Centre over the years on acoustic surveys, acoustic trawl surveys. On the top, you'll see what's a traditional echogram, an output from an echo sounder. There's depth on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is distance, and you'll see a variety of different colours. The redder the colour, the more intense the scattering, and that is basically fish in the water, which many of you, as fishermen, will know is used to catch fish, help catch fish. The red line is the trawl track, the pelagic trawl that's gone through here. And then superimposed on that red line are some symbols. And the symbols are associated with these photographs because the trawl was open at the end. It didn't have a cod end, it had a camera. And the idea was to try and identify what you see on an echo sounder with a camera instead of bringing it up on deck, because when you brought it up on deck, sometimes these things were very small and they passed through the meshes, or they were very soft and you didn't see what they were. And it brought up some surprising things. It, for example, showed that you sometimes saw hake, these are the purple ones, which was the majority of these large scattering areas here, and some dogfish, which they also caught. But they didn't, in the net, catch krill or colonial salps, and that's where some of these scattering areas showed that these components were for. So this gave me the idea that if you used a camera to give you some intelligence about what's going on in the trawl, you could maybe combine that with systems to select in the cod end. So what I'm going to show you now is the components of this idea of a smart trawl. So we have the trawl mouth here, and I'm going to focus on this area in the middle called the extension. So we're going to get rid of the trawl mouth, we'll get rid of the cod end for now, and just focus on the extension. Now in the extension, we split that into two bits. On the one side, we have a selected device, and this is essentially a mechanical gate, which opens and closes the cod end. And there are a variety of different ways of doing that, and we've started to look at different prototypes, working with the engineers at the University of Aberdeen, who've spent their lives working with the offshore oil industry, building components which work underwater. This is one such design, the report has another one, and we're considering others. So a gate that opens and closes the cod end of a trawl. Now, up ahead of the gate, you have a system which works with a controller, and essentially that is a stereo camera. And a stereo camera then allows you, as fish pass by it, to take some pictures, and those pictures, by the use of stereo imagery, can be sized, and ultimately they can be identified. So you can identify the size of fish, and you can identify the types of fish. And then you can send a message to the controller to either open or close your cod end. And if it's something you don't want, of course, you can discard those alive. They can just pass straight through the cod end, just like the example I showed you before with an open cod end. If, however, you wanted to keep those fish, retain those fish, if they were marketable of a particular size, or if you had quota for them of a particular species, then you would send a message to the controller which would allow you to close the gate. That gate then becomes closed, and then the fish get retained and put in the cod end. And that is the simple idea, which relies on serious developments in engineering, of course. In this project, we looked at the feasibility of that, and we worked with a variety of image analysis people, looking at things that we would require for such an exercise. Image enhancement, of course, because water plays tricks on the images underwater. You lose a lot of the wavelengths, but you can correct for that once you know certain things about it, and here's an image correction. Stereo imagery has come a long way. There are now automated systems for determining the size of fish through stereo cameras. We then trialled an existing system. So Daniel mentioned Deep Vision. Deep Vision is essentially the Norwegian version of CamTrawl, the first system I mentioned for you, I spoke about. It was simply a tool designed to identify objects in the pelagic trawl for a research exercise. We've since spoken to Deep Vision. They were involved in this project, and now they are thinking of doing similar things to us, developing the system for selectivity. Here is an example of the Deep Vision system in the mouth of a trawl, which we worked on a survey in the Moray Firth, and these are some images we took in the Moray Firth, and it was a prawn trawler working in quite muddy ground. So even in muddy ground where you have lots of silt, there are plenty of occasions where you get good images that you can work with. So we've trialled the stereo camera, we've come up with some prototype designs, and this is the next phase. I'm glad to say that we've applied for and were successful in getting funding for FIS 24, and we've now going on to this next phase of building an autonomous underwater stereo camera system, much, much smaller than the Deep Vision system, because we know that one of the issues associated with implementing such a system in Scottish fisheries and in many fisheries is that it has to be usable. And so it has to be small and compact, and it shouldn't interfere with regular fishing practices. So we've got a commercial fisherman, the Sparkling Star. Alan Cameron is going to be working with us to deploy this stereo camera system in his trawl in a variety of fisheries, both prawn fisheries and finfish fisheries, which he has quota for both on the west coast and the North Sea. And we're going to be taking images in a variety of conditions throughout the season to see what we can do with these images. We're then going to build and test a suitable prototype gate. And then later on, we'll have to look at images and how we can analyze them and then build a control and communication. But that's very much for the future, so one step at a time. Thank you very much, and thanks in particular to these organisations and to Marine Scotland Science for helping us with the trials on the Moray Firth. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Tara, to one complete presentation, but two very interesting perspectives. Really like the spatial selectivity piece. It was really nice to go from the Pacific back to Scotland. It's a really big ask, the full disclosure piece, but if we can get that system in place, I think that'll be really, really valuable moving forward. And it's really nice to have a mix of the spatial and the technical approaches. I'm sure you guys will agree, really, really exciting, this smart fish, this smart trawl stuff. It really does seem to be fishing 2.0. I think we are now living in the future. So I really look forward to having some questions on this later. But now I have to introduce Stuart Reeves from CFAS, who will talk to us on international quota management. So over to you.
Okay, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to present this work. This is FIS 012A. FIS 012B is to come after T. I think it's maybe just the presentations we've just heard have been talking about selectivity and basically what vessels can do at sea to help control their catches and reduce any sort of choke problem. But it's useful to think that why does choke occur? It's down to the sort of mismatch between what vessels are catching and then what they have in terms of quota and landing opportunities. The two don't match, so that's when the sort of choke occurs. And if you think that what Tara and Paul have been talking about has been on the catch side, on the vessel operations side, well, the work we're talking about here is more about the other side of the equation, actual fisheries management side, particularly the tax setting, quota allocation and trading, and the sort of contribution those can perhaps make to reducing choke problems. So it's very much on that side of the equation we're looking at, particularly sort of tax setting quota allocation. And we did some mixed fishery modelling to try and look at possibly better ways of, if there was any way of improving quota allocation as it stands. But mainly the first thing was just to try and understand how tax setting and quota allocation works with the fisheries we're dealing with. I should say this is another BB project. It started a couple of months before the referendum, so the world is going to be a very different place quite soon, but this is how things still happen at the moment. Scientific advice comes from ICES. That's the initial start for TAC advice. For most of the shared stocks we're dealing with in the North Sea, the actual TACs are then decided in the EU-Norway negotiations. And the EU share of that then passes through this box, relative stability Hague preference, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. And then the UK share of that goes through this process here into the devolved administrations, and then ultimately ends up with the producers' organisations so that the vessels have the quota for what they're fishing for. There's red arrows at a number of steps within this process which actually indicate where swapping or trading occurs. So within the EU-Norway system, there's formal swaps there, but that has to be done within the EU-Norway process. And then there's much greater flexibility trading within the UK and at the moment trading with other EU member states as well. But there's a couple of key boxes within that process that need a bit more explanation. So the first one is relative stability Hague preference. Relative stability was the process that was negotiated when the EU, well, around about the same time, the UK joined the EU and the initial common fisheries policy was established. The EU needed a way of sharing fishery opportunities between member states within given waters. And the process that was came up with after about 6 years of negotiation was relative stability, where essentially all member states get a fixed share of the quotas they're fishing for. And at the time, the shares were based on, although not completely driven by, they were based on a reference period of the previous 6 years or so, 73 to 78. There was another complication on top of that. At the time, it was recognised that a number of states had a particular dependence on fishing. At the time, that was Ireland, the area described as Northern Britain, and also at the time, but Greenland was also part of that. Of course, they have since left the EU. A part of the negotiation came out that the definition of Northern Britain at that point was Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the English East Coast down to Whitby. So it was recognised that, to try and recognise that these areas had a particular dependence on fisheries at the time. Certain key stocks within those areas, these member states were allowed to have a certain preferential share if the stock fell below a certain level. And that's where the idea of Hague preference comes from. The way that the actual numbers are worked out is a black box. It doesn't seem to be properly documented anywhere, and not that I've been able to find anyway. But it was certainly based on reported landings in 1975 within these areas. And that process still exists within the EU at the moment. The UK, again, it's quite hard to trace exactly what happens, but I believe the UK tends to invoke Hague preference for haddock and whiting, at least in the North Sea, most years. I should say that at the time this was established, the stocks in the North Sea were much higher than they are now. This was a period known to some people as the Gadoid outburst. So the North Sea was, well, certainly the cod stocks and other associated stocks were at very high levels at that point. So the reference levels they were comparing with are much higher than anything we've seen since. But the principles of relative stability, of Hague preference still exist to a certain extent. The other side of it is that the whole process was not a complete mathematical process. There was a degree of negotiation and horse trading went on at the same time. And so some of the shares we're now left with sort of are based on the main priorities the UK had at that point in time. And of course, things have changed since then. So that leaves us to the position we're in now in the North Sea. This is a picture of the national shares, essentially the agreed allocations of each stock by member state across these main stocks. So the dark UK in this case is the dark blue. Oh no, I didn't mean to do it. So the UK is the dark blue, so we have quite a large share of haddock there, and whiting likewise, most of the nephrops. The pale blue is the Netherlands, hence the importance of sole and place there. But, I've not been able to find if Norway have a fixed share agreed, but it does seem to be the case from all the recent documents I've seen that Norway also have a fixed share of these stocks. Within the UK, the process is known as, the process was established in the 1990s. But again, based on track record of what vessels have been catching, essentially so that for every kilogram of a stock that a vessel had landed during the reference period, it was given 1 FQA. And this system still holds at the time, holds up to now in terms of how quota shares are allocated within the UK. So where are we now with quota allocations? In terms of our shares of shared stocks, the actual UK quota shares are going back 40 years. They're based on a reference period in the late 1970s. And the allocations within the UK are based on a reference period in the mid-90s, so that's 20 years ago. So we're dealing with the situation we're in now is we're dealing with a lot of inertia. Things haven't changed since the point at which these things were set up, these processes were set up. But what we do have is this, as it stands, is this system of trading within the UK and within the EU as well. And the way that works is that vessels are able to, certainly within the UK, or I think it's generally more at a PO level, POs are able to trade quota in and trade quota out, to essentially adapt the quota shares they hold to closer to what they're actually catching. I got some data from the quota management unit in London in DEFRA, and essentially what it is, it's the quota shares held by each PO at the beginning of the year, and then the quotas held by those POs at the end of the year. So you get a comparison. And this is essentially what this graph is showing. It's the percentage difference between the initial and what I call the adapted quota, the end year quota, which results from trading in and trading out of quota for the main North Sea stocks. What I'll do is the one that stands out there is North Sea hake. I can see Paul grinning there. That's the real problem issue, that the actual adapted quota comes out something like 300% higher than the initial quota there. And that's, I think that's not just trading. I think there's a degree of transfer allowed from Area 6 for hake as well. But what I'll do, The next figure is the same figure, but it's just truncated slightly so you can see the other stocks. But what emerges from this is that you get a fairly consistent pattern year on year of trading. So we're tending to trade in saithe, trade in cod, trade in sole, whereas others, place we're trading out, nephrops we're tending to trade out. So you're getting a fairly consistent pattern year on year in what's happening there. And this is mainly sort of just trading within the EU. Put that together, and how this works for 2015. This is what I call the origins of UK quotas. So the purple quota, on here, well, this is the absolute amounts, but it's actually easy to see in percentages, really. The purple is where the UK is traded in quota from the other member states. The green is trading, swapping within the UK. The red is static. It has a quota that stayed where it was allocated, really. And then the blue at the bottom is where there's some quota come in from the EU-Norway transfers. So you get a different picture from each stock. What you don't see is where we've traded out quota in this case. So the North Sea place and North Sea nephrops, the ones where we're tending to trade out quota, it looks like it's all static, but in fact, some quota has been traded out there. So this is a kind of overall, I think, quite interesting picture of what happens with the different stocks we're dealing with in the North Sea. And kind of as a sort of side order from this, there's a bit of work that almost came out of this. I started looking at a risk-based approach for identifying the stock issues within the stocks we're dealing with. And there's an example here for North Sea hake, because I call hake the perfect storm, in the sense it seems to have all of the problems rolled up into one. But the risk assessment approach we took was looking across all stocks and trying to identify all the possible risk factors. And in some cases, you've got a stock in bad state. You've got it under the biomass limit, or it's fished above FMSY, in which case the quota will be pushed down anyway to try and protect the stock. And that might cause you sort of choke problem just because you've got a small quota or small TAC for conservation reasons. That's not the case with hake. The hake stock's in a very healthy state. It's very high, and it's fished below the MSY level at the moment. In terms of discards at a stock level, and that's an important caveat here, the discard rate is quite low. So if you've got a high discard rate, that could be introducing uncertainty into your assessment. Again, the assessment quality could be causing you choke problems, or just because the forecast isn't very good. There's no obvious reason to think that for hake in this case. I've taken trading. I just showed you that after the trading, the adapted quota is 300%, or is 3 times the initial quota. So that's a symptom of something, a real problem happening there. In terms of assessment quality, again, if the stock assessment is poor, that might lead to problems. But this one is an ICES category 1. There doesn't seem to be any obvious problems with the stock assessment. But the real issues with hake come in the last 3 risk factors here. There's what I've called a distribution risk, in that the hake stock, the hake that's found in the northern North Sea, is part of the much larger northern stock, which extends right down to the north coast of Spain. But so what happens is that the assessment covers that whole stock, and there's TAC advice based on the whole stock, and then that TAC is then chopped into smaller units for each of the areas it covers. And the North Sea only receives 3.5% of that overall TAC. I'm not been able to trace where that figure comes from, but it looks very low historically compared to what the landings have been in the North Sea historically. On top of that, there's been substantial changes in the stock, and this is where Paul comes in. The paper by Alan Baudron and Paul Fernandez has demonstrated a clear increase in abundance and northward shift in the distribution of hake. So there's much higher proportion of the hake stock in the waters to the north of Scotland than used to be the case. And at the same time, the fishery in that area has only really developed since the mid-1980s. Before then, there wasn't that much activity out there. And of course, the local stability shares were established on what the fishery was doing in the late 70s. So you've got this whole series of problems. The stocks changed, the fisheries changed, and you've got it's a small part of an overall quota coming into it. Just, it's quite a complex picture comes into why there's a real problem with hake. I shall touch briefly on the mixed fishery modelling side. The mixed fishery modelling, this is a routine part of the ICES scientific advice now. It recognises that when stocks are caught together in mixed fisheries, your total catch depends on how the vessels respond to the fishing opportunities they have. So on the first plot is the initial ICES advice for 2016 in this case. And then the next two are a couple of mixed fishery runs, one assuming that out of one scenario, all vessels fish until they've exhausted all their quotas, in which case you get over quota catches in this case. The other side, this kind of, if everyone stops when they've exhausted the first one of their quota, you're in a choke situation and you see all the quotas being undershot. There's a lot of data goes into this mixed fishery modelling. There's something like 110 combinations of fleet, nation and fishery or métier going on in here. So it gets difficult to try and present all the information. But one of the ways they do it is what they're calling these radar plots. This is a sort of the same information again, but here presented by a nation level. So where each spoke of these plots is a different stock, and then the length of each spoke is how much effort that nation has proportionate compared to its compared to the fishing opportunities it holds. So you can see in the case of Scotland, in this case, Nephrops is the least limiting stock. Haddock and North Sea Place are also relatively unlimiting in this case. And the last slide, again, I'm afraid this is very complicated. This was us trying to look at how much flexibility does trading bring into the system. Because all the results are based on what happens after trading because of the actual catches, what we tried to do was adjust everything back to if each PO had not been able to trade its quota. So it was, what would the outturn be in terms of that? There was no trading going on. We actually took the basis ICES mixed fishery model and then added in this PO dimension to it for the Scottish POs. And what it comes out is that the POs tend to really hold a large amount of one stock and not much else. But after trading, it looks like the diffusion, there's much more going on in terms of they're able to adapt to catching other stocks as well. So the last slide, pretty much, what is the quota allocation process trying to achieve? The meetings I had with the quota management teams in Edinburgh and London made it clear that they're not trying to do anything. They're not trying to achieve anything specifically. It's very much hands-off and just ensure full usage of quotas. The POs had a meeting with John Anderson of SFO about this, and essentially the main thing I think they're doing is just trying to avoid closing fisheries. And overall, it's very difficult to find criteria to judge how well the system's working, but it looks like this bottom-up approach of allowing the POs to sort everything out for themselves is actually quite effective in helping flexibility. But in terms of choke, there are some, there's a lot of inertia, a lot of history coming in, as I think the Hake example shows. So, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stuart. That was excellent. A really good context, and I actually learned a lot there. That whole inertia piece about some of our quota allocations being based on 40-year-old data is really, really scary, and it helps us to understand why we have such challenges at the moment. Also really interesting, those radar plots and the fact that we're either overfishing significantly or underfishing significantly. So hopefully this will add some weight to the work on the gear selectivity we're doing. And luckily, I noted in Paul's presentation, we can actually see hake on that camera. So hopefully that will help to alleviate this perfect storm. Okay, so we've had some fantastic presentations in this session. Innovation in governance, gear, participation, and some brilliant context. So I'd just like to ask you for a final round of applause for the speakers we've just had. And before I let you guys all go out and caffeinate, I just have to introduce you to Anna Whitveen, who is somewhere here. Would you like to stand up, Anna? Anna is working for Seafish, and she's just been doing some hard work on the best practice guidance for assessing the financial performance of fishing gear, and that has a lot to do with selectivity, I understand. She's actually got a stall outside, so I'd like to encourage you all to go and talk to her and ask her any questions you might have, as with any of the speakers here today. So, without further ado, if I can ask you guys to be back here by 2:45, please, that would be fantastic. Please grab some coffee and refresh. Okay, everybody, we'll take our seats, please. It's time for session 2 to begin. Okay, I hope you all had a fantastic cup of coffee and managed to grab a sneaky scone. We're going to kick off session 2 with FIS 12B, Economic Analysis of Quota Allocation, with Aaron Hatcher from Portsmouth University. Over to you, Aaron.
Okay. Right, you can hear me. Good. So one of the major themes of the last round of FIS projects was the importance of quota allocation at various levels, for particularly in the context of the landing obligation. The aim of this project was fairly simple. It was to see, to develop a model to look at the full impact of the landing obligation and to see whether the outcomes under a landing obligation applying to all stocks could be made any better, or at least a bit less worse, by reallocating quota within the Scottish fleet. Okay, so it's just looking at quota allocation at the Scottish level. I've said there groups of vessels. It wasn't possible to have a model where we're looking at individual vessels' quota allocations. We had to do it by groups of vessels, so groups of vessels within the POs. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Okay. So the objective of the model, I can't show you the model, but I can explain a bit about how the model works fairly briefly. It's a fairly complex bit of software running within a very large Excel spreadsheet. The objective of the model is to maximize profits by varying fishing days, fishing effort in days, and at the end, when we come to it, by changing quota allocations. It focuses on the Scottish demersal fleet, the over 10 metre sector, and the fleet segmented by PO, and within PO by gear type and by area of operation, basically areas 4 or 6. The model was built on 2015 data, so it relies on 2015 landings and effort data and quota allocations. Quota allocations from the spreadsheets by PO. Quota allocations by gear is a bit more difficult. That data essentially is not available. So the quota allocations by gear type are imputed based on final landings within each PO. Catch rates, in common with the work that Seafish have been doing on the landing obligation, catch rates are based on recorded landings, adjusted using the ICES discard data. Quota uplifts are all applied at the same rates that Seafish have been using in their work. And then when we model the landing obligation, of course, we simply force the model to have 0 discards. The model's reasonably sophisticated. I said it doesn't operate at the level of individual vessels. It just would have got too big, too complicated, too many variables. But it's reasonably sophisticated in that where the data shows that vessels were switching between gears or switching between across Area 4 and Area 6, the model would allow effort to be adjusted across those parameters as well. So reasonably sophisticated model, and again, quota allocation not at the individual vessel level, but groups of vessels within the POs. So a few words about the construction of the model before I run through the results. Profits are defined as operating profits, so we're not deducting any fixed or boat costs, and we're not allocating crew shares out of the profit. Importantly, quota lease payments are not deducted from operating profits, because quota lease payments may be payments that individual vessels make, but they represent transfers of profit between vessels or between a vessel and whoever owns the quota. So quota lease payments are part of profit. They may not seem like it, but they are, so they're included in the calculations of profitability. There's no possibility of, at present, of underestimating the proportions of undersized fish in the discard data, so that carries through into the model. We assume all landings are sold at the same price, averages per species for 2015. Fishing costs from seafish data scaled by kilowatts. We assume compliance. It was a bit dangerous to go down any other route. Some of the nuances of the landing obligation were really not possible to build into the model. For example, some of the de minimis allowances and other exemptions. What to do about Area 6 cod and whiting? We just assumed that they were landed. The data reflect the bycatch allowances, so the model reflects a similar level of catches and landings of these zero tax stocks. We're looking at quota allocation. We're focusing on quota allocation, so we're not assuming any changes in species composition of catches. So no changes in behaviour or gear selectivity. Okay, I'll run through the results fairly quickly. So baseline scenario A, it's basically 2015 data. The pictures should look roughly as was seen in 2015, except because we're working with catch data rather than landings data, where there is unused quota, in some cases the model will have filled some of the unfilled quotas. So there will be a few marginal changes in calculations of effort and profitability. But the baseline, roughly 45,000 days, roughly 120 million in profit, split between the demersal, trawls, nephrops gears and other gears. Other gears are primarily nets and lines. And then if you look at the reports for each scenario, we've got a breakdown of the figures by PO and by gear type within each PO. I've just numbered the POs here, just to avoid frightening anybody too early on. So the data's all broken down by PO and by gear type, and also for each scenario, which I'm not going to dwell on. These are all the North Sea and West of Scotland stocks, and we've got uptake as a proportion of the total Scottish quota. The black lines on this particular graph are estimated discards. It's an odd scale, it's a log scale, because otherwise I can't show all these stocks on the same graph, because there's such a wide discrepancy between some of the small stocks and the large quota stocks. Okay, so to begin to impose the landing obligation, we imposed the landing obligation here, but we've got the PO allocations including all swaps, so including quota that's come into the UK and gone to Scotland from other EU member states. Uplifts have been applied, landing obligation in place for all stocks. So total effort's been reduced to a third of the baseline. Total profits been reduced to roughly a half. This is the landing obligation for all stocks. You can see that the hardest, really the most hard hit sector is the prawn trawlers. The highly selective gears, lines and nets, not affected very much. And there's the breakdown by PO and by gear type and stock, quota stock uptake. No discards on this graph, of course, because the landing obligation's been applied. Right, the third scenario, scenario C, it's the worst case implementation of the landing obligation. So we've got the landing obligation for all stocks, but we've stripped out the contribution of international quota exchanges, both in and out. But a lot of the Scottish quotas have been significantly reduced because we've stripped out the quota that's been swapped in. It's mainly quota that's been swapped in, with the exception of North Sea nephrops. Okay, so total profits reduced to about a third of the baseline scenario, effort to little over a quarter. Nephrops trawls, again hardest hit, but not quite as bad as in the previous scenario because partly because of the North Sea nephrops that's come back to the UK. But, okay, I'm going to skip through these fairly quickly, but if you look at scenario D, now this is where the model, as well as allocating days at sea in order to maximise profits, allows quota to be reallocated between POs and between gear types within each PO. Okay, not at the individual vessel level, so there's going to be some quite gross changes, but between POs and between gear types. At the same time as we reallocate quota, effort is automatically adjusted in order to maximise quota uptake and maximise profits. And now we've got 76% of the original effort and 82% of the original profits. The odd thing that stands out here is that nephrops trawls have not only regained the losses under the landing obligation, but have actually gone over the baseline. And that sets a few alarm bells ringing. Part of the problem is that because we're working with the only discard data that we've got, what's happened is that the nephrops trawls have started essentially landing for sale at full ex-vessel price, a lot of undersized fish. So we've tried to compensate for that. So I'm skip through these. And what we've done here is we've run the same quota allocation, quota reallocation again, but we've reduced the revenues from the prawn trawlers' landings of whitefish, not nephrops, but whitefish, by 50%. And we've got what I think is probably a more realistic picture, where we've got about 3/4 of the baseline total effort and total profit about 60% of efforts, 73% of profits for the demersal trawlers, and about 70 to 80% of the baseline results for the Nephrops trawls. And if we reduce the revenues from the Nephrops trawls landings of whitefish even up to 75%, it doesn't change these figures very much. Okay, so just a few conclusions. It's a good idea not to focus too much on the detail because we're modelling changes at the level of groups of vessels, but we are reallocating quota that's there based on, I think, reasonably good estimates of profitability. We've only looked at the Scottish demersal sector, not the whole of the UK. But there is some evidence, I think, that part of the deleterious effects of the landing obligation could be ameliorated a little bit with a greater facility for quota reallocation. Flexibility, I didn't want to dwell too much on the thorny issue of trading. Let's call it flexibility. But the other thing, of course, that this study highlights is the importance to the UK, coming back to the problem of international quota allocation, the importance to the UK and to Scotland of international quota swaps, as well as domestic quota stops. I'll stop there. Okay. So the full report is on the FIS website. It's not actually very long, so it's reasonably readable, I suggest.
Fantastic. Perfect. Thank you for that, Aaron. Very interesting. Pretty grim picture where the full landings obligation put in place with a huge loss of profits, but there's certainly a key part of the solution here with the quota reallocation. Particularly grim for some of the Nephrops fleets, but luckily FIS might have something up its sleeve later for that, so I won't give you any spoilers. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Michael Heath, who will be talking to us about ecosystems, the predator and prey interactions, which is FIS 13. Michael's from the University of Strathclyde. Over to you.
Okay, well, the projects we've heard from so far today have been very operationally orientated. This one's very strategic. This is about thinking about the future, about what that might look like as we move forward into the next, on a decadal sort of progressional stage. So this was a real team effort, this project. We pulled together a group of experts from across the UK and some international invited experts as well to address these issues around introducing a more ecosystem approach to fisheries in Scotland. And we were asked in the remit for the project to address two particular issues: to review predator-prey interactions with fisheries, and to think about what's called balanced harvesting. And I'll explain what that is as I go through this talk. So there were a couple of initiatives that reinforced this or added value to the funding that came from FIS. There's one from MASTS, which is Scotland-based. So there's a lot of the background to the project was conceived as part of the MASTS Fisheries Forum, of which Paul was the chair. And there's also input from a UK Marine Ecosystems Programme, which is a multi-partner organisation spanning the whole of the UK. Okay, so the objectives for this project were to provide the FIS board with some background information that's relevant to how we might implement an ecosystem approach to fisheries in Scotland by producing an inventory of the information that exists out there on what predators and prey are that are affected by fisheries in Scotland, and to review the practicalities of implementing this balanced harvesting scheme for Scottish waters. So this really has got relevance now because the white paper that was published last week includes an explicit statement to pursue an ecosystem approach to fisheries management as an aim for a more sustainable management and account for and seek to minimise impacts on non-commercial species, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's all there. That's what this project is all about, thinking to the future in a strategic way about how we might move in that direction in Scotland. So, what's the motivation for an ecosystem approach to fisheries? Well, the sad truth is that marine ecosystems are inevitably affected by fishing because it involves removing biomass from the sea, it's removing a proportion of the natural production to meet human needs for food, so we're affecting what's available for the rest of the ecosystem. There's no escaping that. But up to now, really, fisheries management has focused on regulating and harvesting the stocks to ensure the sustainability of the targeted fish species, and it's largely closed its eyes to the interactions that that has with the rest of the ecosystem and the effect that it has on other non-target species in the system. And in many cases, those interactions have undermined the productivity of the target stock. So we've seen declines in the size and age of many fish species in Scottish waters, particularly demersal fish species. So the maximum attainable size of cod and haddock is now much smaller than it was 40 or 50 years ago. And it's compromised the productivity of the targeted fish species and the other services that come from the ecosystem. And recognising that we're having these impacts on the sea, have really called for urgent corrective action. So it's important here to stress that an ecosystem approach is not anti-fishing at all. It's about securing the life support system which maintains productive and economically viable fisheries and the other services that come from the sea. It's really important to think about it in those terms. So it's quite difficult actually to get a clear definition of what is an ecosystem approach to fisheries. And there are lots of definitions. And I guess the most sort of comprehensive description comes from the Convention on Biological Diversity, and there's a set of principles called the Malawi Principles, which were drawn up in 1998. And these spell out what should be the components of an ecosystem approach, not just in marine systems, but in terrestrial systems and forest systems throughout the planet. And I've just highlighted in red some of the key points that are relevant to what we were thinking about in our project. So, management objectives are a societal choice. It's up to society to decide what we want to get out of the sea and what the priorities are in terms of conservation and harvesting. But the key feature of an ecosystem approach includes conservation and ecosystem structure and functioning. So we're trying to maintain the life support system for producing food from the sea. And it's got to seek a balance between conservation and the use of biodiversity. And I mean by use of biodiversity, I mean the harvesting of biodiversity without deleteriously impacting it. And this business about should involve all relevant sectors of society and scientific disciplines. We heard something about that this morning in the earlier talks. So the progress in implementing an ecosystem approach in the UK generally has been pretty slow. And that's partly because it's become entwined with conservation and legislation and marine spatial planning. So the principal mechanism for that so far has been the implementation of these marine protected areas, but that falls well short of the goals of an ecosystem approach. It's not obvious that protecting a proportion of representative habitats and sensitive species from the impacts of fishing is in any way delivering the ecosystem approach. Ecosystem approach is about something completely different. So, very briefly, the report's findings. The first section on predator-prey interaction, there's a lot in this report. It's a huge compendium of information. So, what we tried to do is identify the main predators and prey for each of the key fish stocks in Scotland. As the basis for that, we relied on FIS 001, the very first FIS project, which did a complete review of all the fish stocks that were important to Scotland. And for each of those, we went through and said, what are the predators, what are their key prey? And we asked how they're directly and indirectly affected by Scottish fisheries, and we set out some priority research areas to improve the evidence base for these interactions. So very briefly, at current population level, top predators are unlikely to deplete fishery resources, but there's a very, very strong exception to that, and that's the impact of grey seals predating on cod on the west of Scotland, where there's a clear impact on the cod stock. The other side of that coin, which species are affected by fisheries, there's a lot of uncertainties about that, but the clearest case there is the vulnerability of these black-legged kittiwake to depletion of their food source by fisheries. There are other examples in the report, but they're not as clear-cut as those. Moving on to the balanced harvesting story, The report explains what balanced harvesting means, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. But the intention of it is to bring fishing mortality in different components of the food web in line with their productivity. And the idea is that setting mortality in proportion to production rates protects food web components that are rare and allows the exploitation of those that are more abundant. So for the west of Scotland ecosystem, we have examined the extent to which it's in balance, and it's not. And we reviewed the practicalities of moving forwards from today towards a more balanced harvesting scheme. And we identified research needs, etc., etc. So this is a schematic of what we mean by balanced harvesting. On the left is the situation today, and on the right is the future, a perfect world where we've got balanced harvesting. So the green line represents the annual production of different species in the system as a function of their body mass along the bottom. So on the left-hand side, we've got very small things, plankton even, and on the right-hand side, we've got very big things, up to tuna. And it's a fact that small things are very productive, their turnover rate is very high, their biomass is very high, and their annual production is high. And production decreases with the body size of the animals that you're thinking about. But the way that we harvest those at the moment looks very much like the red line. So fisheries are focused on catching big things that people want to eat, but they're not the most productive in the system. And most efficient and balanced way of harvesting the sea is on the right, where the catch is in proportion to the production. So you can get a lot more biomass out of the system as a whole by harvesting in that balanced way compared to the situation that we are in today. Lots of questions and issues arise from that, which I'll go on to in a minute. So, how balanced is the West of Scotland fishery? This is an analysis of the fishery in the West of Scotland during the 1980s. And the red line with the green shading around it is what we would expect the relationship between production and catch to look like in a balanced fishery. And you can see that the West of Scotland is very far from that. It doesn't conform to that line at all. And we can ask the question, what would we have to change in order to shift that fishery to make it more balanced? And we can say that we should we need to reduce the harvesting of pollock, cod, haddock, etc., all the things that people like to eat, and compensate that by increasing the harvesting of herring, sprout, squid, plankton, whatever, all the things that command very low market values. And therein lies the problem with implementing this more ecosystem-based approach. The things we should be harvesting are not the things that people want to eat and don't command high value. So, moving in that direction would require a reduction in fishing on large, low productivity species, and compensating for that by increasing fishing on the things further down the food chain. And there are loads of societal challenges that needed to be addressed to move in that direction. Supply chains and market prices and processing and consumer preferences and local economies and national economies. And you'd have to reconcile balanced harvesting with legislation and management objectives. So, for example, in the context of the landing obligation, landing fish that would previously have been discarded is not necessarily detrimental from the point of view of balanced harvesting. We should land all the fish that are caught. We'd have to compensate that by fishing less intensively on the larger components of the ecosystem. So lots and lots of issues and problems with going in this direction. But like I said, again, this is a very strategic forward look, decadal forward look as to what's happening. If we wanted to go in that direction, these are the big questions and the big conversations we'd have to have across society, really. So, to make this work, how would you manage it? Well, we'd have to manage the system, so we move gradually in that direction. How we'd do it is very unclear. So probably some sort of almost micromanagement of different sectors of the fishing fleet to nudge the harvesting in the direction of this more balanced approach. It would take a long time to get in that direction, not something you could do overnight. So just to wind up, the report we've produced explains what we mean by an ecosystem approach, and we've compiled this inventory of what we know about predators and prey that are affected by fisheries, and we explain the principles behind balanced harvesting, assess the extent to which Scottish fishery is balanced or not, review the issues around it. So it's a very strategic look. And this report's really timely because, as we've seen, our political system is stated that we wish to move in the direction of a more ecosystem-based approach as we leave the common fisheries policy. But I think it's worth noting this business at the bottom that this marine protected area system is not equivalent to moving in the direction of an ecosystem approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. That was a fantastic presentation. As you said, a more of a long-term view strategic piece, but really insightful regardless. Clearly going to be a tough move to more balanced harvesting if that's the way we go, but certainly really interesting to hear that, that there are some effects, but largely there's not a big predation effect west of Scotland aside. And balance can be very tough, especially when it's all your favourite foods. But some of those things didn't look too bad, the squid fisheries, the scallop fisheries. So there's definitely some good potential here in Scotland. So for our next speaker, we have Beth Mowat from the University of the Highlands and Islands, and she's going to be speaking to us about management in shared seas, which is FIS number 14. So Beth, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yes, this is a project that was laid up at the NFC Marine Centre in Shetland by Rachel Shucksmith, and we also had some valuable industry input from the Scottish Fishermen's Federation and some regulatory perspective from Marine Scotland. It'd be very easy for the layperson to look out on a tranquil coastal scene and think, well, there's an odd fishing boat bobbing around and there's a yacht going past. There's actually quite a lot of free space out there. But of course, when you start to layer up all of the different users of the marine environment, it actually becomes very quickly obvious that there's a lot of activity going on in our seas. They're very busy. And there's an increasing policy and regulatory emphasis on effective management of our shared seas, on trying to maximise the benefits from our marine resource in economic terms and social terms, and also in environmental terms. And it's important to acknowledge in all of that fishers are a key user of the marine environment. They're one of the oldest and longest users of the marine environment, and they need to be considered within any planning or development process or management. And that's actually underpinned in the National Marine Plan, where fishers and fishing communities are given specific policy references to make sure that they're included in wider marine management consideration. So the objective of this work programme really was to provide some practical information to help achieve more effective fisheries management in the shared seas context. So there were various things that we looked at within the report, which, as with all the others, is available on the FIS website. The first area really was to look at where potential conflicts might arise with fisheries management and other users. And in fact, fisheries conflicts might actually be within the fishing industry. It might be things like gear conflict. We could be looking at conflicts that might arise with other industry sectors, aquaculture, marine renewables, or we might be looking at conflicts that might arise through marine environmental considerations and management. So we seems to be popping along on its own here. We looked at these types of conflicts and what management measures might be used to sort of mitigate those. We also looked at data, which is really a critical factor underpinning management. Without good data and effective data, it's very difficult to implement effective management strategies. And we reviewed a series of different case studies which looked at fisheries management in the shared seas context with other types of industries. Now, this is a lot to cover, obviously, within this talk, so what I'm going to focus on is really just looking at the data aspects and how that feeds into marine management. So the wider report obviously goes on to provide recommendations for fisheries managers and wider marine managers in looking at the effective integration of fisheries management within the wider marine management field. We also provided recommendations on the effective use of data, which I'll go on and speak about. And one of the things that we were really keen on providing within the context of this report was some guidance, some best practice guidance, both for fishers but also for marine developers to help facilitate that marine management process, and I'll go on to speak about them a bit nearer the end of the presentation if I have time. So, focusing in on data, which is the subject of this talk, what are the kind of things we need to think about? Well, what data is available? There might be a lot of data available for an area at the national level, but if you're looking at a specific local site, is that data suitable? Do you need to look at collecting additional data to facilitate the specific management questions that you might have in mind? Is the data accessible? Is it covered by confidentiality agreements? Is it only present in a fisherman's diary that you might not be willing to share? And is it available in a time frame that's suitable for the management measure that needs to be implemented? Is the data accurate? How was it collected? Do you have confidence in using it in a management context? And is it in a format that's usable at the local level or the wider level? These are key considerations. To give an example of this, obviously spatial data in management is a critical factor. These are 3 fictitious maps that we've created. And the map on your left-hand side here shows the kind of images that you would get with vessels using vessel monitoring systems reporting every 10 minutes on the position. And you can see this gives a really detailed picture of where fisheries are happening within an area and within the space. The middle picture is that exact same data set, but at a resolution of 100 metres. So each of these individual pixels is 100 metres. Now that's still a very fine resolution for fisheries data, but you can see that a lot of this detail is lost. There are areas where fishing's not taking place that now it looks as if it is. And the image on the far right-hand side is the same data set again, but at the level of resolution that you might expect from a 2-hourly ping rate, which is what you get at the statutory VMS reporting. And it's really important to understand these effects of how data is presented. From a fisherman's point of view, they might not be comfortable sharing this data. But when you actually come to look at using the information in marine management, so for example, this is a fictitious proposed marine protected area. If you're only using this right-hand file, it looks like there's fishing happening in that whole area, where in actual fact, probably less than 50% is actually being used. So it's important to understand that. Also, from potentially a development point of view, the purple blobs represent potential aquaculture sites. Now, there's actually quite a lot of free space for these 2 industries to coexist. But as you lose the resolution in the data, it becomes less obvious for potential developers to find areas where they aren't able to impact on fishing. So encouraging fishermen to think about how they share the data and other users to understand what resolution the data is at is actually really important to help lessen impacts on fishing activity and help promote sensible co-location. Again, it's important also for other users of the marine environment to have an understanding of fisheries and what data they might need to ask for. As we all know, fishing is not a 9-to-5 activity that happens in the same space. It's very much affected by temporal factors, the weather. It might be that fisheries are seasonal. So if you think, for example, about the squid fishery in the Murray Firth, for example, if an electricity cable was to be laid during the middle of that fishery, it would have huge economic impacts. But early engagement with a developer could mitigate that and reduce any conflict before development starts. Factors like biological influences. It may well be that there are areas that are important to fisheries that are not actual fishing grounds, and it needs to be important to communicate that effectively so that we can protect things like spawning areas. And also we need to think about socioeconomic data. What are the impacts of developments on fishing? And now that could be in terms of lost ground, but it could also be in terms of things like perhaps a marine renewables site that's been located not on a fishing ground, but it means that a fleet then has to steam for 4 hours to get to their fishing grounds. And that can be the difference between an economically viable fishery and one that isn't. And again, that's specifically referred to in the likes of the National Marine Plan, where communities shouldn't be negatively impacted or overtly impacted on by developments, and that's an important consideration for developers. Looking at environmental data, and again, environmental data and data on what's going on in the seabed is critically important to a lot of developments and to a lot of fisheries as well. But again, it's really important to understand that data. The map here, the detail is not really important, but it represents horse mussel beds, so all of the available information on horse mussel beds. And it's really important to understand where this data comes from. When we started to look at the information for Shetland, for example, some of that data was collected in the 1800s. So the accuracy of some of that data is not going to be as good as the GPS that we've got today. And you can see that in some of the data points that have been transcribed. We've got one that's quite a ways inland here, and we had one on the top of a hill in Shetland. So it's important to understand the quality of the data. And that's also important when you're engaging with fishers to manage potentially these priority marine features. If the fishermen know that a feature's not there, and they probably will, they're not going to have much confidence in a management process that's protecting something that isn't there. So it's all about gauging trust as well. Again, there's levels of accessibility in terms of environmental data. There's a lot of really good information available now in National Marine Plan Interactive. A lot of that's available at the national level, but is that going to be accessible at the local level when you're looking at a specific management site that's maybe impacting on 2 or 3 boats? And one of the key things that we wanted to highlight as well is that if your underlying data is not good and you're relying on habitat maps, the modelling for the habitat maps is going to produce potentially errors. Now, that's not to say that habitats maps are not an extremely useful tool in marine management, because they are, but it's important to understand how they've been produced and to be able to assess the risks and potentially using them to enforce different kind of management strategies. Okay, so what were the kind of things that we found out? Obviously, I've gone through speaking over some of the detail of data. Effective management needs to be underpinned by good data. It's critically important. And that can be making use of best available technology. So we've touched on VMS, but that can also not necessarily be restricted to the fishing industry. It could be something like making sure that any seabed infrastructure relating to development is where it's supposed to be, that it's not out of place or not bigger or having more impact than it said it would. A critical point that we wanted to bring across as well is that in the examples that we looked at, early stakeholder engagement is critical to ensuring success. Good engagement, good communication, building up a relationship of trust, that really helps to create successful management structures. Management measures that work as well should be specific. If you're looking to protect a priority marine feature, protect the priority marine feature and not a much wider area. One of the examples that we looked at that wasn't specifically related to fisheries was actually an example where shipping was managed around cetaceans, and they used a rolling programme whereby they identified where the cetaceans were. The vessels within that area had to slow down, and it could be different times of the year in different areas. So the management was very much adapted to the situation. So another example of adaptive management, again, was off the coast of France, where we had a gravel extraction, an aggregate extraction, which was stopped during certain times of the year to permit spawning, and other times of the year it was moved slightly further offshore to allow a cuttlefish fishery to be taking place. So there are really good examples of management that allow different users of the marine environment to interact in the same space at different times. And one of the interesting points that we also drew out of this was that statutory management is actually quite important. When you're going through the development process and looking at how to build up a management measure, voluntary basis can be really good in making sure that you've got everything right, but in actual fact, to maintain good compliance and to make sure that management is effective, actually bringing in statutory measures is quite important. I mentioned at the beginning that we produced guidance notes, and they might be available, I think, in some of the packs, various versions of them that you got at the start of the day. And the first one we wanted to produce was for fishermen, and it details the different kinds of developments or other uses of the marine environment that they might have come across, and it helps them to understand what kind of information they need to provide to facilitate good communication and to facilitate effective management from a fisheries perspective. It's also important for them to understand when they need to engage in the process, because sometimes, particularly with planning and licensing, there can be specific points that they need to respond by. And also that, in some cases, responding is a formal process. Some fishermen might feel that they've phoned up and spoken to their local fisheries office and that's them responding, but in actual fact what might need to be included to be considered as part of a consultation, for example, might be an actual written response. And we also produced a similar document for decision makers and developers that provides pretty basic information actually on how fisheries operate. Something as simple as the fact that a scallop dredger might need a turning circle at the end of their toe that needs to be factored into a development is quite important, and often that level of detail of information and knowledge is missing. And also how developments might affect fishing. I mentioned earlier the example of having to steam around a big site, and developers might want to think about maybe, for example, in an offshore wind development, look at how they can design their site so that once it's in there, for example, a static gear fishery might be able to use that space at the same time. And another thing that we highlighted in there is how they can undertake effective consultation. Who do they need to speak to find out who fishes within a certain area, and how do they engage with them effectively? And I think that's me. I just wanted to highlight the number of people who were involved in this project and to thank, obviously, the Fishermen's Federation of Marine Scotland for their very valuable input. Okay?
Thank you, Beth. That was a fantastic presentation. Excellent timing. Some really good guidance there. I think that will be really useful for us moving forward with Scottish fisheries. And really good to reiterate the importance of data. The challenges of data resolution I've always found to be a struggle, and that was a really, really good way of highlighting that with those pictures. Some key themes running through a lot of things today: trust, credibility, communication, early engagement, always key issues, and some great examples. So thank you very much for that. So it's now my pleasure to introduce you to Amaya Alabat from the University of Stirling, who is going to talk to us about FIS 15, which is Nephrop Survivability 2. So she's already done some fantastic work on Nephrop survivability in the last round of funding. And actually, we were so impressed we wanted to see some more and answer some more of the questions. So we're going to hear about that today. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to be talking about survival of discarded nephrops today, and a little bit of background in the project. I think this audience is very aware of the Reform Common Fisheries Policy and the reinforced strategies to reduce discards, one of them which includes the landing obligation for species which are subject to catch limits or quotas, except for some specific exemptions. And one of these exemptions are for those species where there is enough scientific data showing that they have a high post-catch survivability. Now, originally, when that came about, the values that they were being quoted for survival of post-trawl discarded nephrops was around 25% survival, and that was based on studies they were from the 70s, 80s. But more recent studies carried out by scientists at the University of Sweden were showing that actually the survival estimates could be higher. And they did a study where they reported 42% survival in the summer and 75% survival in the winter for grit gear, and 38 and 59% summer and winter for when using Celtra gear. However, these type of values, these survival values, cannot be extrapolated from one fishery to another, and therefore specific trials need to be done for the different fisheries, the different nephrops fisheries. And therefore this project was actually doing that. And it has been estimated that the costs of disposing these discarded nephrops would be around £2 million a year across the fleet. And that was according to the de minimis application. So the objectives of the project, quite straightforward, was to conduct tank-based nephrops post-trawl survival trials using a representative vessel. In the West Coast, we did the trials in the Minches, taking into account seasonal variation, and we also conducted trials in the East Coast in the Firth of Forth, but only in the summer season. And I'm not going to show this data today, but if anybody is interested, then please get in touch. The second was, okay, so we are working with a representative vessel, but how does the data from this vessel sort of marries, sort of is comparable to the wider fleet? And that was done in collaboration with the Scottish Fisheries Federation. And through these two objectives, we were able to generate a survival estimate of discarded nephrops. And the third one is all these trials were done in tank-based survival. And the question was, well, can we start to understand which is the behavioral responses of these animals when they are actually released into the seabed? So we did some underwater camera observations. And finally, we put all the data together and tried to figure out which were the environmental or the fishing practices that they were happening on board the vessel, which could be associated to post-discard survival, and that would allow us to generate a set of recommendations for best practice to minimize discard mortality. So the protocol for these tank-based survival trials, we went into the vessel and we recorded the environmental parameters on the day and the fishing practices, like the tow coordinates, the tow duration, sorting time, air temperatures. We also recorded the catch composition of the target, the nephrops, and also the non-target species, and that allows us to calculate the amount of the size of the discarded nephrops. And we also took a sample of 20 discards, nephrops discards, and we evaluated which was the initial condition of these nephrops. We took an extra 100 discarded nephrops, and we again recorded the initial state of the animals by some visual indexes that I'll explain later. But in this case, these animals, after being recorded, they were placed in tube set boxes and they were placed in onboard tanks. And we also recorded when the people the crew were sorting the catch, which was the mortality of discarded nephrops at that point, because that had to be taken into account in the survival estimates. Now these animals, they were transported to containers to the aquaria at SAMS in Oban. That took more or less 2 hours. We recorded oxygen temperature, and we also had control animals that were going through the transport and also during the time that the animals were stored at SAMS. And we recorded the survival for up to 13 days. And at the end of the trial, or when an animal was dead, we recorded damage again, and we also recorded the other visual indexes. So how do we record the initial state of the animals or at the end of the trial? Well, we record the vigor index, and here are the categories that we recorded. And we also recorded damage in the different types, in the different parts of the body, like Kelly, rostrum, and so on. So about the trials were done in the fishing vessel Ocean Trust, which operates from Malaysia. This is a twin rig vessel, and it's fitted with a 200mm square mesh escape panels, but it doesn't have selective gear per se. And we conducted 12 trials in the summer and 12 trials in the winter. But in the summer and also in the winter, 6 trials were done with that vessel being fitted with Tier 1 cot-end. So that means that the cot-end in the net is 100 or more millimeters. And 6 of the survival trials were conducted with a Tier 2, which in that case was 80mm nets. So when we did these trials in the summer, the air temperatures in the summer between 14 and 19 degrees, and in the winter between 7 and 11, and the tow duration in the summer around 3.3, and in the winter 3.5 hours of tow time. And we also see how the sorting time is linked to the weight of the prawns in the catch, and the sorting time, it was normally between 1 and a little bit more than 3 hours, and rarely above 4 hours. So when we look at the amount of nephrops that they were being discarded, per tow we got an amount in average around 600 animals being discarded. If we put that in context of weight per nephrops, it's around 3%. So it's not a lot, but I guess it sort of adds up tow after tow. And this is the carapace length, so this is the size of the discarded nephrops. So you can see that in that area, the minimum conservation size is 20mm, so that means that around 97% of the nephrops that are being discarded are above that minimum landing size. Around 88% of the discarded nephrops, when they were being sorted on board, were actually alive during sorting. We did see a small but significant difference between winter and summer, and that was taken into account. And in terms of damage, we didn't see a difference in damage percentage between the summer and winter trials, and around 60% of the animals showed some sort of damage. An interesting point here as well is that if we record the damage on board the vessel, we would get around 40%, but if we record damage again once we are in a tank system, then the damage is higher, and it's because it's very, very easy to miss out punctures, for example, when you are on board and everything is moving and so on and so forth. So it's important to realize that although on board you might be recording 40%, the reality is that there could be more damage that you are missing out. What about the vigor index? In both cases, the majority of the animals were in a vigor index 3. That means that the animals are, the muscle, the tail muscle doesn't have tension, so the animals are pretty exhausted, but they are aware of the environment and they are able to react with their limbs when they are touched. And we did see a difference between summer and winter, and that means that in the summer we get more animals in vigor condition 4, which are really animals that they are moribund, that they are really exhausted. So in terms of survival, then this is how we are going to be plotting survival. so this is the survival proportion and time, and we saw no differences in survival between if the boat was fitted with a tier 1 or tier 2 net. And for that reason, from that point onwards, we took both data sets together. But we did see a difference in season. So actually, the survival in the summer was lower than in the winter. And the survival estimates were, as here are shown, 53% in the summer, 62% in the winter. But of course, we had to correct for the animals that they were dead whilst they're being sorted, so that was taken into account. And so the final survival estimates based on 12 toss for each season was 45.7% in the summer and 56% in the winter. So across both seasons, the survival estimate came at 52.7%. And this was using that particular vessel. Now, the method that we've used is not something that we sort of came up with, but that was the method that is recommended by the working group from ICES and methods for estimating discard survival. And the experimental that we follow, like transporting the animals and having the animals in the aquaria, produced actually very low negligible death. So we were confident that the mortality was due to the trawling process and what was happening on board rather than us moving the animals around. So how extrapolable were those values when we go to the wider fleet? And so that was done by the observers from the Scottish Fisheries Federation. We gave them over sampling tables. We explained to them what we were recording, and so they went out and they did that. So we had data from 3 single rig vessels and 3 twin rig vessels. And so for comparison, we had 10 tows in the summer and 14 in the winter. And so we compared all these data, which I'm not going to show, but in general terms, we saw that the data from our vessel was very much in range to the data that it was being recorded in our in other vessels in terms of environmental conditions of the days that we did the trials, and also in terms of tow times and sorting times, and in terms of damage, which is quite a key parameter. So which of all the variables that we measured were associated with the survival of discarded nephrops? And one of the key ones was damage. So damage had a negative effect on the survival of discarded nephrops. And the second was the air temperature, so these seasonal effects, and also the fact that we saw a lower survival when we had higher number of animals in this moribund, very poor vigor condition measured after catch. And finally, we also saw an association, although that association is not as strong as the other ones, in terms that lower survival was associated with higher weight of non-nephrops catch. From all the other data that we looked, we didn't find any other direct links. And so once we've done the tank survival based, the next question was like, so how do these animals sort of behave when they are released into the environment? So we performed 15 dive, and the depth was between 17 and 115 meters depth. And we observed the responses of 23 discard nephrops. And what we saw, and these are typical nephrops grounds with the burrows, and what we saw that in generally nephrops did enter the burrows within a few minutes. But in the cases where nephrops were exposed in air for a long period of time and they were pretty exhausted when we put them out, it took them longer. It took them longer to go into the burrows, but they still had this sense of being aware of the environment and looking for the burrow. So the recommendations, which were based on the parameters that we found associated and also a little bit on the behavioral observations, are here. Handling strategies to minimize damage, maintaining cool air temperatures in the hopper, the reduction of non-nephrops catch, which we also think might be associated, and also that nephrops should be discarded over suitable grounds. In these behavioral observations, we were not able to record the mortality due to predation, because in the videos that we recorded, there was no predators. Whether that was site-specific or due to the ROV, the presence of the ROV, we actually don't know. So what happens with this data? So we finished the project in January, And when we finish the project, we send the data to Marine Scotland, the policy department, and they send the report to Marine Scotland Science. And Marine Scotland Science looked at the report and decided that they were going to use this data to request for an exemption in 2 regional groups. So that's the North Western Waters, nephrops caught between 80 and 110 otter trawl, and sub-area 6A within 12 miles of the coast. And this data, it's the only available data to support that. While in the North Sea, then very, very similar, also within 12 miles of the coast, but here there's also included the data from the CELTRA and the NetGrid studies, which have been done by other groups. So that was done in the regional documents, and that went into the joint recommendation documents for North Sea and Northwestern Waters. And then that went into the STECF, and I haven't seen the report out from the STCF, but apparently they didn't raise any questions to this data set. So in August, September, it is expected that the draft of implementing regulation from the Commission will be available, and that the final document will be published in October. And if that goes through, then the regulation would come in force in January 19. So this project was done between myself in the University of Stirling and Clive Fox at SAMS. We are very thankful to these people and also to Fisheries Innovation Scotland for funding the project. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, Maya. That's an excellent example of how a FIS project and innovation is positively affecting Scottish fisheries. So fingers crossed for October, and this is really making a difference on the water. So that was fantastic, really good systematic approach. I love the presentation. I really like the piece on vigour levels, so I'm just looking to the audience to see what everyone's vigour levels is at the moment. There's a few ones. No 4s, thankfully. I think 2 and 3. So hopefully we'll pick up for this next presentation. So here we have Hannah Fennell from the Orkneys Fisheries Association. So she has proactively come to FIS and applied for our international study bursary, where we make funding available for people to go and see another fishery in another part of the world, see how it's done over there with a specific question. As a knowledge exchange partnership. So Hannah's very kindly decided to talk to us about how she got on, and I'm really looking forward to hear about it. So Hannah, please go ahead.
Hi, yes, my name's Hannah Fennell, and I'm this year's winner of the FIS International Study Bursary. So my project was looking at social capital in the fishing industry, or how we can make relationships better. To do this, I travelled to Denmark, and I wanted to answer 5 key questions. So first, I wanted to know how meaningful relationships can be created, how we can maintain them, how conflict is created and how we can mitigate it, how different groups collaborate, and also how the fishing industry in Denmark is diversifying. So as I say, I went to Denmark and carried out a series of interviews with fishermen, scientists, processors, harbour authorities, pretty much everyone that would speak to me. It was really interesting, and throughout all my interviews, I was bearing in mind the concept of social capital, which simply defined is just the relationships and bonds formed within and between communities or groups that allow them to work together. So depending on the people involved in the relationships, there's 3 types of social capital. You have bonding, bridging, and linking. Bonding social capital is the relationships within a community. So this could be a physical community, such as a fishing village, or it could be a more symbolic community, such as the Scottish Whitefish Fleet. Bridging social capital is the relationships between communities, so for example, 2 fisheries associations. And then you also have linking social capital, which is the relationships across scales. So connections made with governance actors, so things like this conference here today. So bearing these in mind, I started to try and answer the 5 questions I mentioned earlier. I wanted to look at how meaningful relationships are created. And the key thing I found is, it sounds quite simple, but it's the identification of a common interest. The Danish Technical University, DTU Aqua, their marine branch, has a really good relationship with Danish fishermen. And this relationship was founded by them wanting to do more research into stock assessments in Denmark. The fishermen felt that the stock assessments at the time weren't representative of what they were seeing when they were out at sea, and DTU Aqua wanted to change this and to see if they could improve it. So they identified an area of common interest, and they also defined a goal, which was to improve stock assessments. It was also important to take small steps because obviously this isn't going to happen overnight. Finn Muller is a fisherman and a processor from the town of Hirtshals in the very north of Denmark. And he was speaking about how they'd tried on several occasions to create a fisheries association, but it hadn't always been successful. But ultimately, when they did manage to find their common goal and when they did manage to find their common interest and take their common goal, they managed to work towards it and set up the association. So once you have your meaningful relationship, you need to work out how it can be maintained. And the key to that is good communication. As I was talking about with DTU Aqua, they make sure to constantly keep in touch with the fishermen they work with. So they have a website where fishermen can get regular updates on the projects they've been involved with. And also it's a place for fishermen to get feedback as well, or give feedback on their experiences working with them. DTU Aqua also regularly sends its students out onto fishing boats, so they get real-life experience of what they've been learning about in the classroom. Also, the older relationship is, the more stable it becomes, which is very important when it brings us on to our next topic of conflict. Because unfortunately, conflict is always going to be inevitable. A week before I arrived in Denmark, a report had just been published, and it was saying that the level of illegal discarding by the Danish fishing fleet was much higher than had previously been thought. This had caused a huge rift in the Danish fishing industry, with fishermen and fishing associations refusing scientists and onboard observers access to their fishing vessels. So the theme of conflict was very much on everyone's minds while I was over there. So what happened is that DTU Aqua started to put more emphasis on their personal relationships, the personal relationships that their staff and their students had with the fishing industry instead of their institutional relationships. This allowed DTU Aqua to find the root cause of the problem with the Danish fishing industry, which was not that this report had come out, but that there was concerns about where the data from the report had been gathered. There were concerns that the report data was not gathered through onboard observer ships, but was actually through scientists that were meant to be researching things like gear selectivity. So once they were able to find out this root cause of the conflict, they backtracked, they looked at where the data was from, and they were able to say to the fishermen, this is not the case. The data had come from onboard observers, and they began to trial and heal the rift as well. Nearly, actually, every scientist I spoke to kept repeating to me the importance of objectivity in their work, in both avoiding conflict but also mitigating it. The beauty of science is that no matter if it's a very small fisheries association or a very large one, or it's a research institution, that it levels the playing field, and if science is carried out objectively, anyone can enter the conversation. So that's just one example of the collaboration between different groups in the fishing industry. There were loads of really lovely examples of collaboration, so I've just picked a few of my favourites because I'm not sure how much time I have. But one of these was also the Thropstrand Coastal Fishermen's Guild, which some of you might have already heard of. Thropstrand is a small town on the very north of Denmark. It has an old-fashioned fishing fleet. It doesn't have a harbour, so every day they have to pull their boats onto the shore of the beach. Because of this, they have a really, really high profile in Denmark. Everyone I spoke to told me I had to go and visit Thropstrand and see them pull the boats onto the beach. So this was a really interesting example because Thropstrand had a really strong link and connection with the University of Copenhagen as anthropology department. Anthropologists who had been born in the village worked really closely with the fishermen, helping them set up their fisheries association, but also writing several papers and doing work on the impact of new legislation and laws on the livelihoods of the fishermen themselves. Because of this, the fishermen were really able to elevate their voice and speak to decision makers and governance actors and get their opinions and voice out there. Another nice example was the Hirtshals Fish Festival, which started several years ago, and the goal of it was to get the local community more and more engaged in the fishing industry, because the town at the time was struggling because it had a lot of conflicting industries, including tourism, aquaculture and renewable energy, and they wanted to increase the profile of the fishing industry. So this festival was meant to be a one-off, but it's happened every year since. And finally, another example of the collaboration was D2 Aqua and sending their students out onto the fishing boats so students could learn from the fishermen and fishermen could learn from the students. Again, it was just a really nice way for the two groups to get to know each other and to break that initial boundary and begin communication with each other. In Denmark, the fishing industry is diversifying in a number of ways. One of the more interesting ways is the adoption of science by lots of different bodies, including small associations and larger ones. And as I said earlier, that's important because it levels the playing field and allows everyone to enter into the same conversation. You also had expansion into upstream and downstream processes. There were individual fishermen and groups of fishermen that had worked together to create new trade links with Norway and Iceland to get price for their catch, and also fishermen that were working with universities to design better gear. And you also have coordination with people outside the fishing industry. For example, the town of Thropstrand with the University of Copenhagen's anthropology department. So I want to just talk briefly about how we could potentially apply these things in Scotland to fishermen, fisheries associations, scientists, and managers and decision makers. For fishermen, I think the key thing was to try and tell a story to learn about, to tell a story to find out what made your fishing industry unique, what may capture the public imagination, and how you could create a dialogue with that. Thinking of Thropstrand and how they use the narrative of pulling the boats onto the beaches to capture the public engagement and to get the politicians interested. There's also excellent connections with a lot of small fisheries associations employing scientists so they could speak to governance actors and decision makers and help influence the outcome of these things. Scientists, the main important thing is objectivity. And for managers, the most important thing is to make sure fishermen and fisheries associations are empowered to enter into a dialogue with yourselves. So that was a very brief overview, and I just want to say thank you to FIS for the funding and the opportunity to go. It was really interesting.
Thank you, Hannah. That was a fantastic talk. First of all, thanks to you for taking the initiative and coming to us with the plan. And thank you for a really educational presentation and going out there and getting that knowledge and also thinking how to feed it back into the Scottish industry. I'm really looking forward to seeing some of those things come in. And actually, I learned a lot from your presentation. So that was fantastic. Thanks very much. I think one of the key things there for me is that it's a two-way knowledge exchange. So often projects look to learn from the fishermen, but also there's a lot of information coming back that way, and actually a lot of the things I've learned about fisheries have been trips out on fishing boats and with those guys who are out there every day and seeing those things. So again, thank you very much for that. Now I would like to introduce you to Richard Slasky, who is our FIS Exec Director, and he is going to talk to us a little bit about some of the research that we've done so far.
Thanks, Dave. Good afternoon, everybody. So we've heard about the last round of projects, and now we're beginning to think about what are we currently doing, and of course tomorrow we'll talk about even wider issues. We had the acronym BB before Brexit on a couple of our projects. I've got PRP here, post-referendum pause, in the sense that Fisheries Innovation Scotland did not commission another tranche of projects the year after the last ones you've just seen. For very good reasons, because we just had the referendum result. We were uncertain as to the direction where the research should go. So that actually did give us a chance to think and collect our thoughts. And with the help of the TAC and everybody in the board thinking and having had a little bit more time to think about it, these were the key topics that we decided to advertise for in this coming round. and we ended up with 6 projects. I won't read them out because they're up there on the screen, and they will be there for a minute. We got good application rates, because of course, I should actually do that one. We advertised them in the usual way. We got a good round of applications, very high quality applications actually, which gave our TAC and then our board a lot of work to do. The interesting things are the first one, FIS 024, one application, but the perfect application, the follow-on from other work that we'd already been doing, and we'll see who that is in a moment. The surprising one was no applications for innovations in energy efficiency and fishing. And we've been thinking about really we're all now about fuel, care with fuel and all that sort of thing, but we've been thinking about wind-driven things. And, you know, we wanted people to think outside the box on energy and marine energy, and nobody bit at it. If I'd been a contractor, I would have applied for that one. So there you go. That's a bit disappointing. So obviously we're not progressing with that. The others we're going ahead with. Once we receive the application, it's the usual discipline that FIS has. Independent assessors of all the applicants, obviously anonymous and confidential. And then the full TAC appraises all the applications, sees them all, makes recommendations to the board. The board sees all the applications and the recommendation and the assessor's report, so then makes its final selection, which in this case was in April of this year. And these are the projects that are now up and running. So FIS 024 in water improvement in selectivity. You've already had a flavour of it from Paul because it is a logical follow-on, and it's very exciting. Novel approaches to fish, trapping, fishing and surveying. This is interesting. We know there are areas of Scotland which are really for static gear only, that effectively catching fish in these areas is difficult. What if we could use traps and pots of some sort of, as other parts of the world do? So again, quite an interesting piece of work. Marine Scotland Science won the contract for that. Both of those top 2 projects, quite long, field-based, 18-month projects, relatively expensive. FIS 26, Fishing Strategies to Manage Benthic Footprint. This is a pilot study, if you like, a desktop study to scope out other ways. We all know about, again, gear and being careful with benthic environment, that sort of thing. This is a little bit different. It's beginning to map out what the benthic environments are and are there different ways of mitigating effectively impact through behaviour, through temporal changes in fishing and so on. So very interesting. Hopefully, when JNCC have completed their work, there'll be some interesting pointers to some field-based pilot studies after that. Workshop on fisheries resilience to climate change. Well, climate change is on everybody's lips all the time, of course. We thought it was appropriate at this time, this year, to take stock of what we know. And one of the reasons for that is pragmatic. As we approach leaving the European Union, it is zonal attachment. All of that, where are the fish stocks and where are they going and what are the trends and so on. So a nice workshop to bring together. There's a lot of work out there, of course, but could we bring it together and crystallise it? And again, the University of Aberdeen, Tara is leading this project. We're going to do that. I should say that the Board of FIS also looked at one of the other applications for this. I won't say who yet, but effectively, rather like that, it was a different approach. And depending on how FIS 028 goes, there may be a possibility for us to revisit a rather more focused, targeted workshop in a different sort of way after that, but we'll see how that goes. And the final one, which is the introspection of any organisation, is, are we doing a good job? And we sort of think we are. But of course, you can't evaluate. It's very difficult to evaluate the effectiveness of what you do internally. It's a process I've tried to do with SARF and also with FIS, but it's very hard to be objective about it. Sometimes you do need an external look at that. And so we've asked Anderson Solutions to come in, and actually Donald's going to do the first presentation of the new round of projects before he's barely even started the work. I'm sure he has, but because it gives you a bit of a flavour of that. And again, I would urge you to talk to him and his colleague Jennifer in the margins over the next couple of days, because your stakeholder feedback into his work will be important for FIS going forward. Few other key points. Total value of the projects is £422,000. We've applied for EMFF support for that. We don't know whether we'll get it yet. EMFF is still available and will be for a little bit of time yet. So fingers crossed that we can do that. We've actually made a running start with all these. We always have steering groups for all the FIS projects. And we have an early steering group we call an inception meeting, which is usually very, well, they're always very enjoyable, but they're usually very important in just fine-tuning the details of what's going to happen. Well, we held all of those very quickly and efficiently. I'm delighted, and so these projects are all up and running. And I think that's everything I want to talk about with this one. I've got one announcement, Dave, if I may, just before I forget. It's on my piece of paper. Those of you that are coming to dinner tonight and are staying at the halls of residence, if it's your first time and you're not certain how to weave your way through town, I and a few others will meet you in the lobby of the halls of residence at about 5:45, okay? And we'll walk up in a group together. Dave, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Richard. Nothing there to add, just to say we've got a really exciting batch of next projects, and I'm really looking forward to the results of those. So, Richard, you did a fantastic job of introducing Donal, so over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Does that work? No, it does. And this. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Richard, for the introduction. My name is Donal O'Herlihy. I am, as you can probably gather from the name, the principal of O'Herlihy and Company Limited. And Jennifer Russell, I beg your pardon, of Anderson Solutions and myself are leading the evaluation of the FIS programme. It's probably worth, just by way of introduction, Jennifer you may have come across her if you're in the fisheries sector. She's done quite a lot of work in different aspects of fisheries projects and fisheries policy, and is a Shetlander. So she and I have done some projects in Shetland over about the past 10 years, and she and I have worked together for about the past 20. She is the fisheries expert, and I am not. So I am the innovation expert, and she very kindly put a half-pager together for me in advance of today's conference, so that if anybody came up to start talking fisheries to me, I might have a clue about what it is that you're actually saying. So, but the idea is that I work on the commercialization of research, and I work on developing impactful research, and I work with research institutes, and I work with commercial organisations as well. And she is much more on the fisheries side. Jennifer is here tomorrow. I'm here for a while after, as Richard said. In terms of what the purpose of what it is that we're trying to do is that we have basically 4 key principles that we're looking at. The first is to assess whether the research supported through FIS has achieved its goals, the goals it was set out to do. We also are looking at whether the research has addressed the problems that it was aiming to answer when it was set out, and those two things are subtly different. We also wish to know as to whether FIS or anyone else would have been required to act upon the research findings, and this is where we get into the assessment of impact. And it's important to identify that at this stage in order to assess how that impact might occur. And seeing some of the presentations earlier this afternoon has certainly given me some key leads, and I might follow up with some of you if I can catch you immediately after the session today. And the last point there is actually vital. You can have a piece of research undertaken. It can lead to a kind of a step change or a single impulse response, and then it dies away very quickly. And one of the things we will be looking at from the point of view of our study is as to whether the benefits or any of the benefits that accrue actually last some sustainable length of time. We're looking at up to FISO 15, and that is to take cognizance of the fact that it takes time for impacts to accrue. So none of the more recent programs, it wouldn't be appropriate to assess impact for that, although we might look at the appraisal process for them actually, if there was any changes. The research that we're undertaking is split into 2 phases, and the first is what we would broadly term internal, and this is the piece that the focus of it will be looking at what the terms of reference were effectively for what the research exercise was designed to do, and the process that the researchers went through, the outputs they produced, how those outputs were peer reviewed, and what was the final production or formal research output from the exercise. So and when I say it's internal, this is the bit that relates to FIS. So it's the bit that the funding comes in, the research gets done, the output gets produced, and that is the envelope really over which or around which FIS has a locus or an influence. FIS tends not to be able to control, and nor can anybody, I don't think, in any situation that FIS is in, what happens thereafter. So the second phase looks at what happens in the external environment. And here what we're looking at to see is, as a result of the research output that's produced, does it have an influence on any particular group, policy, fisheries approach, learning, follow-on research? Does it have an impact upon the research groups to give them improved capability or competence? So we're looking at a very broad range of factors and influences to try and see if we can establish what the benefit might be. And actually, your presentation about the study tour that you did, that would be something we'd very much like to have a chat with you about that, actually, if that's okay. And while I appreciate that many of you in the audience will be researchers associated with individual projects, I am also well aware that many of you are not, but that you would be people who will be interested in the FIS output. And we would be very interested in talking to you if you are aware of an output from a FIS project that either you yourselves have picked up or that has been picked up by somebody else within your organization or within a partner organization. That's fine. The initial, Richard said, you're presuming we got going. We have got going. We've had a look through the projects. And what we've observed is that the early projects, this is the first two groups of projects, focused on informing fisheries management. They covered policy, catch parameters, quotas, and stock management. And to assist ourselves, and so that we can get some kind of structure to how it is that we approach the evaluation exercise, we've identified 4 broad headings, and these are the headings that we plan to work within, and that's regulatory change, business development and innovation, exploration of fisheries management approaches, and impact analysis. And the earlier economic modelling one, which just after the tea break, was an interesting example of number 4. As I mentioned, if you've been a recipient of FIS money, we will wish to have a chat with you, and we will be in touch. I know some of you have been involved more than once. We would particularly like to have a chat with you about that as well, as to how the different projects related and how they benefited from each other. We would also be very interested if you have not been involved in the research project, but would like, but have observed an impact or were able to use the output in any way. That is something that we would be very keen to have a chat with you about. And we're taking a very rounded and open assessment of impact in this case, or definition of impact in this case. That's who we are. So I'm Donal at O'Herlihy.com. Jennifer, as I say, who will be along tomorrow, is Jennifer at andersonsolutions.co.uk. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Donal. We'll look forward to talking to you in the near future. It looks like a very comprehensive study design you've got there, and it's going to be absolutely pivotal to the way that FIS move forward. So really looking forward to that one. Okay, guys, so thank you very much for sitting through the presentations today. I know you've all got some burning questions, so before we go into the round of Q&A, I'd just like to have another round of applause for all the presentations today. So thank you to all the presenters, and we've got some fantastic pieces of work, so be sure to look that up online. The research is all freely available, so hopefully we can use that in moving forward Scottish fisheries. So now over to questions. We've got about 20 minutes for questions, so who would like to kick off? Tough crowd. John.
John Goodlad, Chairman of FIS. A very quick question to Michael Heath. Michael is. Fascinating piece of work. You indicated that to get a ecosystem-based management approach, you might have to catch less of some species and more of others. And if I got you right, you're saying that one of the species you should catch more of on the west coast is herring, and yet ISIS are saying we shouldn't catch any herring at all.
Yeah, well, at the moment, that's right. But the question is, why are we not catching much herring on the west coast at the moment? Is it because of the pattern of fishing throughout the rest of the ecosystem? I mean, that's been the problem with fisheries management up to now, is we've seen each species in isolation, not as an interacting network. So, yes, it's quite true that herring is down at the moment on its knees, but why? And we don't know the answer to that question yet.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Michael. Question here?
Mine was for Dan. I don't know where he's gone. About partnership working. So there was a big bit at the end of the white paper about quite vague. I was just wondering if Dan has any lessons that could be applied to that going forward, specifically in Scotland, given that it was so vague on Scottish issues.
Good question, thank you. Dan?
Yeah.
Oh, there's feedback there.
I'll just move a bit. Where to start? I don't know. As I say, the case studies that we looked at, the three there, all kind of focused a bit on partnerships and where we can use transfer knowledge. So particularly with the IFCAs, that was an interesting one that we kind of talked to the FIS panel about, and we're quite keen to include it. Not quite an international case study, but so maybe I could talk about that one for a bit. That's where I know a bit most about. And what was really interesting in that is the change in what they anticipated their change when they became IFCAs from SFCs. You know, it was a little bit unforeseen. We didn't know what was going to happen. You know, they have to start bringing in the recreational sea anglers as well as commercial anglers and change their responsibility from purely kind of enforcement to bring in conservation. So they had all these new stakeholders to kind of engage with. And so I think the report kind of comments on that about, you know, I see the IFCAs as somewhat of a success, and they have this flexibility that they've changed over the time. And for me, I think that's the key thing with a lot of these areas, is having that flexibility to kind of evaluate, self-evaluate and change based on, you know, your own performance, rather than, as I say, having these kind of 10, 25-year goals. I often find them a little bit difficult because you never know when something else like the land obligation or a referendum is going to come along. So I think for me, flexibility, being able to kind of change, I don't know whether that really helps answer your question.
Thanks, Dan. Question here?
Hi. My name is Pim Visser. I have a question for Dan. Looking at your presentation, it's very much procedure-oriented. And my experience is that in these kind of things, especially my experience with about 10 years of the North Sea Advisory Council, it's also about personal relationships and about how you're into it. And what we're experiencing in the North Sea Advisory Council is there's a bunch of old guys who know who've been there from the beginning, and there's new kids on the block who just come rushing in, and to get that into a good group and working together is a specific problem. And you don't get a solution with just sticking to the procedure.
No, I totally agree. I don't want to comment necessarily on its wisdom rather than age, possibly, but No, I mean, we're doing a lot of studies at the moment as well with all the POs across the UK, and I mean, we're doing studies which we spoke to you about as well, and it's fascinating how, yeah, you're right, the personality of the people in charge dictates kind of the influence of that organisation that PO may have, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. You know, it's a brilliant thing. We need more people like that. I don't really know where I'm going with this response, but I think, so one of the things that we tried to do in the study as well was to bring to the fore the idea of this kind of you know, remote communication, like this e-democracy where you can get everybody's kind of involvement in it. And I think that's really important. The other thing, as I said quite a bit in the presentation, was about kind of, it's not just a case of giving these people the opportunity to participate. As you said, you can give them a seat at a table, but if they're not really, you know, an orator, like, you know, some of the guys here will be able to turn up to a meeting and convince me to do something I didn't believe in the morning. You know, so it's allowing them like the right tools. What situation can they communicate in? And that's not necessarily sitting around a table with 5 other people who've been doing it for 40 years. So I think going forward, it's kind of thinking of new ways to communicate, not just having, as you say, round table discussions.
Great, thanks Dan, thanks Pim. We've got another question here in the middle.
Yeah, thank you. Just next to him, just pick up the phone. The microphone, sorry. My name is Gerrit van Balsvoort, and I have a question really to the program and also Mr. Slasky. It seems to me, also 2 years ago and again now, that the program is very much aimed at the immersive fisheries. That means that FAS is not really targeting what's happening in the pelagic fisheries. I know that the pelagics doing a lot of stuff themselves, and also into innovation in research like genetics, for example, own surveys, other things. So is that just by coincidence? Maybe I just remark something which is just a pure coincidence, can be, but or is there something bigger underneath it? Thank you.
I'm going to pass this one on to our chairman, John, because he has a deeper understanding of the industry. So having said that, I'm going to talk about Dutch and pelagic fishing tonight in my opening speech for the dinner, so you'll get some insight then.
Yes, Gerard. No, there's no intention whatsoever to concentrate on one sector, and I think we have done some little work on pelagics with one joint project, which wasn't actually summarised today. But I think the main thing two things, I think. Firstly, FIS is a relatively young organisation. We've just had 15 research projects over a period of 3 years. And I guess we've kind of focused, which is the FIS model, on the areas where we believe innovation can best help the Scottish industry deal with its problems. And I guess over the last 5 years, most of those problems have been in the demersal sector and the nethrop sector. The pelagic sector is not without its problems, but has been less pressing perhaps. But I fully expect that as we go on, we will look at other sectors. We've also done quite a bit with shellfish. So the intention is to be completely comprehensive. It just so happens that most of the work so far has been on demersal, but I'm sure that will change.
Actually, I'm just going to do a follow-up on this as well, because John is right. We've had a number of small projects that we've done over the last 2-year period. Interesting ones. People have come, they've not things we've not advertised. People have come to us. The board's looked at them and said, yeah, actually, we should help with that. And one of the nicest ones is actually in the pelagic sector. So I urge you to talk to Ian Gadd and Steve Mackinson. They're in the room here. We were able to help with a bit of project. But the point was, it was about, well, it was concerning the concept of industry self-sampling. And the point was, we were looking at the pelagic sector as being one that could really sort of help lead and develop a template and a model that other sectors could pick up on. So it was actually very positive, yeah.
Sure, thanks guys. There's nothing really to add there. We did some pelagic stuff earlier on with Paul, and it's something that we certainly take into account. I think of the challenges, the demersal industry has a lot of issues and potentially not quite as much capital to spend on solutions, so naturally we've been focusing on there. But we try and keep it wide. We've got representation from the inshore fisheries on our technical advisory committee, and you'll have seen from Richard's presentation we're looking more innovative methods such as trapping and line fishery. So it's always on the radar, but I think as a young organisation, so far that's been where more of the focus has been with things like the landings obligation and where the challenge lies. But we're absolutely not set on that, and we're open to anything in all Scottish fisheries. But thank you for the question. Any more questions? Okay, we have here and then Paul.
Yeah, hi. Hi, my name is Ian Kinsey. I've got a question here for Michael Heath. When you were talking about fishing further down the food chain, what do we do with a large stock of mackerel that is fishing down the food chain now? Because what's been experienced in many places now that there's not food for mackerel. It's only the large mackerel now that can make use of the fry of other fish that are doing reasonably well, whereas the small mackerel are really starving. On the coast of West Norway last summer, we experienced many cases of mackerel about 350 grams, 400 grams. They were full of mackerel fry or young, as big as 12 centimetres. We've experienced along the coast that fish like saithe, for example, are disappearing, and local cod. Last month there was a fisherman that fished a mackerel that had over 40 herring fry in his stomach, and this is just one of a shoal of about 500 or 600 square metres that was just going along in a harbour, So how would you reply to this?
Okay, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Are you suggesting that there isn't the plankton production to support fish anymore?
No. What's being suggested is that we have a mackerel stock that's grossly underestimated and has been for years and years now. And this mackerel stock is devastating zooplankton, for example.
Well, I'm not sure what the evidence base for mackerel having devastated the zooplankton stocks really is. Can you explain that a bit more?
Normally, when you catch mackerel, you have a look at the stomach contents and you see what's eating, as you do with any fish. And what's been noticed over several years now, there's been very little zooplankton in mackerel. And also, what's been noticed over the last 10 years is the average weight of a mackerel has decreased by about 40%, 50%. And this has got to a stage now that it's even starting to create problems in markets. Okay. So there's a shortage of food.
Okay. Well, you're saying that mackerel appear to be not thriving for a reason that may not be necessarily related to the abundance of zooplankton, because the behaviour of mackerel is affected also by water temperature and climate. So what appears to be a problem there is the interaction between zooplankton and mackerel may well be affected, but that's not necessarily reflective of a lack of zooplankton in the water. So I'm not aware of any evidence that zooplankton production has declined. It may well be the case that mackerel are not thriving, but that's a different issue in a sense.
Fantastic. Thank you both. I think it's a really interesting conversation, but perhaps one we should continue over drinks or dinner, because I feel like we could get lost in the detail there. But thank you for raising that, Ian, and Michael, thank you for answering that one. I believe, Paul, you had a question? And Doug at the top afterwards.
This is a question for Stuart. Very nice presentation, thank you. In your mixed fishery analysis towards the end, and including in the radar plots, correct me if I'm wrong, but hake wasn't included. I just wondered if that is actually the case, or is...
You're correct. As it stands at the moment, hake is not included in the standard mixed fishery analysis, so it wasn't in the base model we had there. So
the next question...
In fact, you'd see it would be such a small dot, you wouldn't see it anyway, because it's so limiting.
Okay, so if you included it in the mixed fishery analysis, I mean, presumably being a choke species, it'd have a big effect on one of those scenarios. I mean, can you comment on what the likely outcome is if you did?
I mean, without doing the analysis, it's difficult to say, but I think it would certainly choke a lot of fleets, I think, overall in the results, yes.
Thanks.
Okay, Doug at the back.
Were there any lessons learned from the international quota management study that would give us an understanding of the critical differences within other paradigms within the EU? But more importantly, I think, will it be used by ICES, or does it have any utility in interpreting the stock assessment results in terms of understanding fleet behaviour? Because it seems to me quite a unique or rare expansion of like the stock assessment stuff into fleet dynamics, which is always something I looked at in the previous incarnation.
Well, certainly, I mean, the mixed fishery analysis is now part of the standard ICES advice. I mean, it's not used to set TACs as such. It's a way of trying to illustrate or demonstrate the effect of the set of TACs you're setting. You know, it's recognising that in some cases you're going to overshoot, in some cases you're going to undershoot just because you're dealing with a mixed fishery. And that work is now, actually it is starting to influence TAC sitting as well, because the MSY range concept, whereby you're not, the Commission at least, or the EU is moving towards setting rather than a fish mortality based on a point estimate of MSY, it's allowing some flexibility within a range about that point estimate. So in some cases, there's been proposals to set TACs so that you're at the lower end for some stocks and at the upper end of the range for other stocks, to try and recognise this mixed fishery impact while still achieving, you know, or moving towards the sustainability goals. So in that sense, the mixed fishery work is already in there and it's happening. And as I said, there is a lot of data that underlies that. The North Sea, as I said, is something like 110 different fleet gear nation combinations they're using. So a lot of work goes into that at the moment.
Fantastic, thank you both.
Duncan McInnes, Western Isles Fishermen's Association, and this question for you, Michael, in relation to West Coast cod and grey seal predation. And my question is, you know, will cod stocks on the West Coast ever recover unless there's some plan in place, you know, to control grey seal number?
Yes. So it's certainly possible for cod stocks to recover on the West Coast. But what will happen is that fishing mortality rates that were seen as sustainable 30 years ago, when seals were less abundant, won't be in the future when seals are more abundant. So it's quite possible to have you know, a sustainable cod fishery on the west coast of Scotland in the future, but at lower fishing mortality rates than we had in the past, because there's additional predation mortality on the cod that wasn't there before. So the fishery will have to contract to make way, if you like, for the increased predation from the seals. So MSY may go down, for example, for cod on the west of Scotland, but that doesn't mean we can't have a sustainable fishery in the future, just at a lower level.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks, Duncan. Any other questions? Pim, again?
A very practical one.
Sure.
We were here 2 years ago, just after the referendum. After that, we had a BP. And part of the pause was that there was supposed to be an exchange of projects, views, innovation, etc., because we have to prevent inventing the wheel at many, many places at the same time. So in view of the developments, we don't know how long this Brexit process will take. Can't we just take the initiative and bring the people together who have these innovations and talk about it and learn from each other. Wouldn't that be something to think about in the coming 24 hours?
Absolutely, Pim. I feel like that's what we're trying to do today in part. But I'm going to hand that over to Richard, who looks like he might be handing over to Bertie.
Yeah, well, I think that's a fascinating question, actually. And my view is that we don't yet still know enough. But
Yes, Pim, hello. There'd never be a time when our industry would not wish to talk to anybody else in the sea space, of course. And there's no reason in God's earth why cooperation and coordination couldn't still happen. An interesting feature of what's happened, and it really is the stuff of tomorrow, which is where are we going with future fisheries management? And I, amongst others, will say a few words on that tomorrow. But a lot of what we've looked at did by no fault of those who did the research whatsoever, because the whole scene changed, as you rightly point out, has been overtaken by events. That acronym, or a set of initials, BB, are relevant for most of this. And the reason is this: there will be a change in sovereignty, and there will be a change of how the management fundamentally works. So, and whereas we looked at in some detail in one of the projects at the internals of management downwards, at no stage did we address the overall change. And we'll look at that tomorrow. But with regard to coordination, of course, naturally, providing you have a dog in the fight.
Okay, guys, if there's no further questions, I'm going to thank everyone for their questions and for the responses, and hand over to Richard and John. Oh, sorry, my apologies. We have one last question.
My name is Niels Wiekman. Several speakers have looked into survivability. In your views in Scotland, what is high survivability? I would say 5%. What do you say?
Well, that's the $1 million question, I think. I'm not sure we've got an answer to that one. I think any survivability is better than none, but it's really important for us to map it out, and then we have to, I think this was for politicians. That was where I was getting to.
Yeah. Can I just chip in?
Sure,
I think that was the careful answer. You were absolutely right. And my careful answer to this is, let's not forget that question. There are not the people in this room today at this conference that I would hand this microphone to and say, could you answer, your perfectly sensible question. There may well be tomorrow. So keep that question in your mind would be my advice.
Absolutely. Thank you, Richard. Okay, I think we're done for questions. Everyone happy? In which case, I will put you in the capable hands of Richard and John for setting the scene for tomorrow, fisheries management in changing times.
Thank you very much. And well done. Bear with me a second, everybody. Let's pick up this handheld one. I'm going to just do this short session by myself, and I am going to actually very much truncate it, because you've all got a copy of the programme. I don't need to read out. You can see who's speaking to us and who will be having conversations with tomorrow. And of course, it's a really fascinating programme. We'll put up both parts of the day. What I really want to say is we've had a fantastic afternoon. Thank you very much to Dave for chairing David Park. Could I get a round of applause again, please, for David? Second year I've asked him to do this, or Kristen or whatever, and in both cases he's done an exceptional job, I'm sure you agree. Tomorrow We have a full day, we have a busy day, we have a fascinating day, we have international speakers, honoured guests, I'm looking at ministers and so on. So it's going to be very interesting. What I would like to urge you to do is what you've done today, which is actually, when the question time panel sessions occur, please put your hand up and have these discussions, because they're interesting, they're useful. I think we all learn something from them. I don't have anything else really that I would like to say, other than I hope you enjoy a pleasant evening. Some of you are coming to the dinner, that would be lovely. For the rest of you, there are some excellent eating establishments in St Andrews as well, so it's a wonderful place to spend an evening. We're starting nice and early tomorrow. I'll remind myself, I should know what time we're starting. Maybe I will make that work. Go on, tell me somebody shouted out, thank you. 9 o'clock, so again, if people could be here about 8:45, something like that, that would be fantastic. John, do you have anything to talk about at this stage? Anything I've forgotten? No? So again, a reminder for people who want to have an accompanied tour to Old College Hall this evening, Old College Hall, to meet up in the lobby of the Halls of Residence at about 4 to 6, 10 to 6. Okay, thank you, bye-bye.